Hello everyone, and welcome to a tour of Yoshi's Island. This video is a full playthrough with commentary of the Super Nintendo game Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. I'm going to be going through every stage of the game and talking over my gameplay with analysis about the game's design, its development, whatever comes to mind really. Yoshi's Island was the first game in what would become a successful spin-off series to the mainline Super Mario titles. Many things set it apart from the more conventional Mario games, like the game's main character, Yoshi. The gameplay between the two series differs the most thanks to Yoshi's Island's greater focus on a scoring system. Every stage in Yoshi's Island gives the player a 0 to 100 score depending on how many of the level's collectibles they were able to find. The point is to achieve a perfect score in every stage, so I did just that for this commentary. With that over with, let's begin by discussing the intro. It's one of the longest introductions a Mario game had ever seen at the time. It might even beat some contemporary titles. If the player was so inclined though, it could always be skipped. I think its length is justified however, as this game requires a little more explanation than your average Mario title. Yoshi's Island is a prequel to every single Mario game before it, taking place when the plumbers were newborns, being delivered to their parents via stork. The stork is intercepted by the Magic Koopa Kamek, who intends to steal the babies before they can become a problem for the Koopa Kingdom. Baby Mario wasn't grabbed, however, and instead he literally fell onto Yoshi. The Yoshis together decide to help reunite the twins, and that's where the game begins. From that point onward, the story is almost non-existent until the final moments. Newer fans might not realize this, but the story of this game is actually a pretty huge retcon of the original Mario backstory. The original storyline involved two Brooklyn plumbers named Mario and Luigi who got transported to the Mushroom Kingdom one fateful day. Whereas this game changes their backstory to always hailing from the Mushroom Kingdom. The Mario series has never been about the story though, and the original backstory had never been properly explored in any of the video games, just supplementary material. So for those reasons, I imagine the Yoshi's Island team felt more than comfortable changing the backstory to fit the narrative of their game. The prologue of this game features a heavily different style than the one seen throughout the main adventure. One of the fathers of Mario, Shigeru Miyamoto, when interviewed about this game, explained that he and the Yoshi's Island team were pressured into making the game resemble titles like Donkey Kong Country, which is well known for its pre-rendered 3D aesthetic. Miyamoto pushed back on this, and as a result, we got the more crayon pastel look Yoshi's Island is famous for. This intro, however, is definitely pre-rendered 3D. It makes me wonder if this was what the game would have looked like if the higher-ups at Nintendo had their way and Miyamoto didn't. Yoshi's Island's staff roll credits one designer for the computer graphics, Yoshiaki Koizumi. Koizumi is likely a familiar face to fans of Nintendo games. He was the director for later 3D Mario titles like Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Galaxy. He's also one of the more prominent presenters in the Nintendo Direct live streams. This CG work was his second credit at the company. Yoshi's Island was worked on by a lot of then Nintendo alumni, but it also had its fair share of people who would later go on and make a name for themselves in their own right. Upon starting a new game, the player will be shown a short cutscene and taken to a quick tutorial level to help explain the mechanics. Yoshi has a surprising amount of tools in his kit. It's a great expansion from his last platformer appearance in Super Mario World, where he was basically just a glorified power-up with some personality. Don't get me wrong, I liked Yoshi in that game, but this game made me love him. Originating from this game is the flutter kick. By holding down the jump button, Yoshi will kick in the air, which gives him a bit more airtime. It can be used an infinite amount of time while airborne, however, there's a bit of a cooldown in between jumps. If the player is frame perfect, they can actually suspend themselves in air indefinitely, but it's far from easy to pull off. In addition, like in the original Super Mario games, Yoshi can get extra air with a flutter jump by bouncing off of an enemy before doing it. At first glance, this might feel like a crutch of some sort, but I would consider that to be a reductive takeaway. The flutter kick can certainly save Yoshi in many tricky platforming sections, but it's a much more unruly move than a run-of-the-mill double jump, meaning it can be mastered. It was a move conceived for this game specifically, and I really like that the Yoshi's Island development team made a move that feels truly unique to Yoshi. Miyamoto in particular made many tweaks to the flutter kick to make sure it felt satisfying to use, and it paid off in my opinion. The next big aspect to Yoshi's kit are his eggs, which are presented front and center for this first stage, make eggs, throw eggs. Eggs can be obtained via a few different ways, but the most common method is by pressing the Y button to have Yoshi grab enemies with his tongue. Once in Yoshi's mouth, the player can press down to swallow the enemies and produce an egg. It's pretty morbid when described, but the look of the game and Yoshi's comical expressions help to take my mind off of it. Something minor about this action that I've really come to appreciate is the fact that the player has to press down to swallow the enemy. Some future Yoshi games would do away with this action as it's somewhat superfluous, but I believe it's here very deliberately. Of course, the obvious upside to having this in-between state is the ability to spit enemies back out, but that's not what I'm referring to. I'm more appreciative towards the action of pressing down itself. I don't know how much immersion someone can truly get out of a game like Yoshi's Island, but pressing down on the D-pad to send an enemy down through Yoshi's body to create an egg has to account for something. It's just intuitive. By pressing the A button, Yoshi begins to cock one of the eggs back, like he's about to pitch a baseball, and an aiming reticle appears on screen, going up and down repeatedly on an 80-degree or so angle. Pressing the A button a second time will send the eggs flying at a blistering pace in whatever direction the reticle was. This is the core of Yoshi's Island's gameplay loop. Getting to grips with making, aiming, and throwing eggs is practically mandatory to truly complete and appreciate this game. So it's fitting that this first stage has the player use them in a multitude of different ways. The piranha plants that block the first underground section of the game can only be defeated with eggs. They cannot be eaten or jumped on like the Shy Guys earlier in the level. This section is also mandatory to 100% the stage, so right off the bat the game is teaching the player to use the breadth of their kit and explore every nook and cranny of a level. The final object that can be struck with eggs are these question mark clouds, which, like their appearance implies, can do all sorts of different things, from creating new interactable objects to producing stars. Speaking of, in the underground section of the stage is this red flower. When an egg is thrown in the top side, it spits out 7 little stars. Stars function as both health and part of the end level grade. The health system in Yoshi's Island is a little out of the box compared to other games. Excluding sources of instant death like spikes, lava, and the like, Yoshi can actually take an unlimited amount of hits. But when Yoshi gets hit, he and Baby Mario get separated. When that happens, Baby Mario will float around in a bubble crying as the player's health total goes down. When it reaches 0, Baby Mario gets picked up by Kamek's goons, and then the player is handed a loss. Recovering Baby Mario is quite easy. All that needs to be done is to have Yoshi come in direct contact with him via his body or tongue. That said, unless Yoshi gets Baby Mario back instantly after he's lost, a timer penalty will still be doled out. What makes this more forgiving though is the decision to have the timer slowly refill after it drops below 10. This is an interesting decision because it greatly assists novice players that frequently get hit by enemies while doing little favors for more experienced ones. Why is that? Because of the end level grade. Each stage on Yoshi's Island has 5 flowers, which are each worth 5 points, 20 red coins, and the opportunity to accrue at least 20 stars on top of the starting 10, which equals 100. To truly complete Yoshi's Island requires acing a level, not just by having a good eye for secrets, but also being proficient at platformer games. Since the regeneration only occurs when the star total is in the single digits, it's not very useful to those attempting to keep a high star count. Yoshi's Island isn't afraid to turn on the spectacle. One early example of that occurs in the second stage of the game. The first major obstacle of this stage are the incoming chomps, a Mario enemy that's a riff off of the Chain Chomp enemy that debuted in Super Mario Bros. 3. You can see them roaming in the level's background, but when Yoshi passes by their gaze, one will jump out of frame and reappear in the foreground, burrowing a hole in the ground in the process. When I was a kid, this enemy really frightened me, and my anxiety persisted in some capacity over the years. However, on this most recent playthrough, I found out that they don't actually hurt Yoshi, despite what their appearance may imply. The only danger with these chomps is their ability to drag Yoshi down into the depths with them, which, to more reckless players, isn't unlikely, but my most recent revelation really helped to defang these enemies for me. In addition, it's pretty simple to make the chomps despawn just by walking off screen. This is unfortunately a common issue in a lot of older video games, so while it's disappointing to see, there was probably little that could have been done to remedy it. It'd be hard to ignore Yoshi's Island's graphical fidelity any longer, so I shall wait no more. I expect it'll be repeated many times throughout this commentary, but each time it comes up I hope to use it as a springboard to discuss something else. One of the best things about Yoshi's Island's graphics is something of an unsung hero, and that's the fact that the entirety of the screen is dedicated to showing them. What do I mean by this? Okay, to spell it out, I mean that there's no HUD actively on screen in Yoshi's Island, with the slight exception of the timer appearing when Yoshi ends up idle for too long. HUDs, or heads-up displays, are an element of game design that almost feels like second nature at times. The Mario games are no strangers to them either, but Yoshi's Island does a lot of work to make sure that the player doesn't even realize the HUD is missing. A lot of things that would normally be displayed by being abstracted out via a HUD are parsed to the player in different ways. The egg reserves are always visible on screen. A distinct sound cue alerts the player when the final red coin is grabbed. A 1-up is rewarded when all 5 flowers are found, and stars become coins when the maximum amount has been collected. Other elements that were featured in older Mario titles have either been reworked into the grading system with the score, or removed entirely, like the timer. The timer mechanic had always felt superfluous to me. It was always quite lenient, meaning that stages in older Mario games were never a race against time. However, my main gripe was that its sheer inclusion added an element of stress I don't think was needed for a series like Mario. So I'm happy this time around it wasn't included, as the timer would have been even less welcome in a laid-back game like Yoshi's Island, where exploring stages at the player's heart's content is core to the design. Another core design element is this. Leading the pack for the first of many transformations is the helicopter. Transformations are a central gimmick to Yoshi's Island. The helicopter is probably the most iconic of the bunch, if only due to the fact that it's used the most. While transformed, Yoshi ditches Baby Mario and takes on a completely new control scheme. For the helicopter, Yoshi can fly in any direction, as well as sport a fast maximum speed. This first test drive is a good showcase for not just the helicopter power-up, but the transformations in general. The environment is low stakes, there's no bottomless pits for Yoshi to fall into, and enemies are extremely scarce. So the player is able to get their bearings and take as long as they need, but it's not just that. The area also features loads of secrets that contain collectibles which are necessary to 100% the stage. This section is telling players you will still be expected to find secrets. The transformations are temporary, and if a Yoshi block isn't tapped before the time limit runs out, Yoshi will return to where the transformation first occurred. I always found the face on the Yoshi block to be funny. I can't decide what emotion is trying to be conveyed here. It looks somewhat similar to the look of shock Yoshi makes when he first transforms. But unlike that face, his eyelids are here. It may look like he's disappointed or something. Which I suppose would be something Yoshi and I have in common. The helicopter may be the most iconic of the transformations, but that doesn't mean that I like it. Its control is incredibly slippery, making precise movement difficult, and it's not as if I can just take my sweet time in these sections. I am timed after all. When I use the helicopter, it almost always takes me more than one pass to collect everything the game expects of me. I'll have more to say about the transformations as they rear their heads later on in the game. The Cave of Chomp Rock is our first underground level, although you wouldn't really know it from this introduction screen. I like that instead of being thrust into the underground environment from the get-go, we're given a little context as to how Yoshi ended up down there. There's actually a lot of effort put into making Yoshi's Island as a location feel like one huge place as opposed to a bunch of disconnected video game levels. So I'll point out many of the more noteworthy ones as this playthrough progresses. This isn't the first appearance of the Chomp Rock, but first impression or not, it suddenly appearing right behind Yoshi at Mach 2 speeds isn't just humorous, but also explains how the Chomp Rock will work if the player hadn't come across it in the underground section of the first stage. It can be rolled across the ground, popping enemies it collides with in the process. It can also be used as a modest boost to reach areas Yoshi couldn't otherwise. There's an example of this later on in the level even. With the rock having the unique chomp face sculpted on, it makes it very clear to players that the rock is being rotated. Most might not even recognize how unusual this is for a Super Nintendo game to do so. For those unaware, allow me to explain. The Chomp Rock is a sprite, and the default hardware of the Super Nintendo is actually incapable of rotating and scaling sprites. What it could do, however, is scale and rotate backgrounds. something that's shown off front and center via the likes of F-Zero and Pilot Wings. That effect is attributed to the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 video option, a name that anyone with slight interest in the Super Nintendo is likely well aware of. Mode 7 is similar to the Sega Genesis term blast processing, insofar as it was a term that got thrown around a lot by marketing teams back in the day, to the point that it sometimes gets credited for things it isn't even capable of, like the scaling/rotation of sprites. That feat is made possible in Yoshi's Island thanks to a particular add-on chip inside of the game cart, one that I'll sure to be discussing shortly. Just know this. While this isn't too flashy of an effect, it is something the base SNES hardware would be hard-pressed to do on its own, so mechanics like the Chomp Rock, Piranha Plant rotation, and many other subtle effects would be impossible to implement the way they are now, if not for a certain chip. As for Mode 7, Yoshi's Island still finds a way to get some use out of it, namely the island effect on the title screen. Just for what exactly else though, well, you'll have to wait and see. This level is where the player is formally introduced to the ground pound. While Yoshi is in the air, pressing down will cause him to halt all forward momentum and come careening directly downwards. This move may seem like a combat move first and foremost, but in reality it's seldom used for that purpose. There's just too much wind-up to attack anything that isn't stationary. It's mostly used to break open wooden crates or hammer conspicuous stakes into the ground. These stakes are all over Yoshi's Island, and many of them hide secrets necessary for 100%ing a level, such as the path to a secret area or something as simple as a red coin. I don't like how these stakes were implemented. Unless the player has memorized these levels down to every minute detail, the average secret hunting player is going to meticulously ground pound each and every one of the stakes down to the floor to check to see if a secret is hidden in one. Maybe if each secret was universally discovered after 1 pound, this would be a different story, but it's not. It varies from stake to stake. The task just feels monotonous. An interesting tidbit about the ground pound, though, is this marks the first time the move was ever used by a playable character in a Mario game, and would get adopted by the titular character in Super Mario 64. This isn't the only time something from Yoshi's Island would later be used in Super Mario 64, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little. 1-4 marks our first ever fort stage. Every 4th and 8th level in a world has Yoshi explore a locale similar to the castle stages of the Super Mario Bros. Series. I don't think it's a coincidence that they appeared as frequently as in the eponymous game of that series either. Much like those castle stages, these also feature a boss fight at the end of them. These stages have always been some of my favorites in their respective worlds, and not just for the obvious reason, although that certainly is a big contribution. Yoshi's Island likes to show off a lot, and never is that more clear than in these stages. On paper, the collapsing wall isn't much different from the Chain Chomp scene in Stage 2. The background is interacting with the foreground. The presentation, however, is key. The early 3D look of this wall made a much bigger impression on me as a kid. It sticks out, in a good way. In addition, it also has a different appearance from the other walls, as well as ample wind-up, so getting hit by it doesn't feel too cheap, even though this is a surprise. Originally, this was gonna be the part where I went into great detail in explaining that this 3D effect was made possible due to the add-on chip found inside of Yoshi's Island, the Super FX2. The Super FX chip first saw use in the landmark game Star Fox, and is famously responsible for that game's low-poly 3D look. The Super FX2 is a successor to that chip. Yoshi's Island was one of the very few games to use it. Nintendo used the phrase morphmation to explain to the technologically inexperienced what it was capable of. Since Yoshi's Island features many examples of rotating sprites, something we know the stock Super Nintendo wasn't capable of, we can credit the Super FX2 for that. All of this is to say that I think I speak for many when I say that I thought that those 3D looking doors, alongside many other visual marvels seen in this game, were made possible solely due to the Super FX2. After doing some research, however, this appears to not be the case. That wall, along with all of the other 3D objects, are actually clever optical illusions. Here's a visualization of what exactly the SNES is doing to give that 3D appearance, courtesy of a Reset-era user, Puck. Even the massive enemy sprites, such as the Blarg featured later in this level, and of course, a majority of the bosses in Yoshi's Island aren't exactly sprites. At least not in the way you'd think. The effect used for these enemies is actually done using something called HDMA, or Horizontal Direct Memory Access. HDMA is a feature of the stock Super Nintendo hardware. To be completely honest, I barely understand it myself, which is why when my search for info on Yoshi's Island and its Super FX chip ran dry, I approached someone who I had a feeling could elucidate things. If you don't know, RetroGameMechanicsExplained is a channel that, well, the name kind of says it all, doesn't it? One of his longest running series is explaining the ins and outs of the Super Nintendo hardware, one aspect at a time. Knowing this, I emailed him, and now I properly understand just what exactly the Super FX2 is doing in Yoshi's Island, outside of sprite rotation, which I explained earlier. The Super FX2 is a coprocessor. It handles a lot of the more complex computations that would slow the base NES hardware to a crawl if done only with it. I'm told that the HDMA effects seen in Yoshi's Island aren't that taxing, even if there's a lot of them. Alex wasn't sure that the Super FX2 had much to do with those. He was, however, adamant about how intense sprite rotation and stretching would be on the hardware. He believes that everything in Yoshi's Island could be done on the base NES, albeit at a huge cost: performance. Yoshi's Island runs at a rock-solid 60 frames per second. There are very few dips to that frame rate, something that its predecessor, Super Mario World, a much less visually impressive game, running on the base NES hardware, cannot boast. I would liken the Super FX2 to titanium bracers that hold the bridge that is Yoshi's Island together. The Super FX2 is a very fascinating aspect of Yoshi's Island's development, and I'll be sure to say more about it later. The first boss of Yoshi's Island is Bert the Bashful. He's an oversized version of an enemy introduced earlier in this level, and is original to Yoshi's Island. Bert has grown to become one of the most recurring enemies in the Yoshi series, and I believe this first impression is a huge reason why. Yoshi's Island bosses follow a fairly rigid formula. A regular enemy is introduced, Kamek the Magic Koopa appears to monologue, then leaves after casting a spell that grows the enemy to gargantuan size. Bert isn't unique in this process, he just so happened to be the first boss any player happens to see. Not to sell Bert short though, even in a vacuum, he has a pleasant looking design and has one of the funniest defeat animations in the entire game. Best of all, he's fun to fight. His large size means that he's very easy to hit, so even players who haven't gotten a complete handle on egg throwing can still eke out a win. He also gets knocked back with every hit, which, while maybe a little unruly, is satisfying all the same. Bert is a fantastic first boss, and sets the stage well for future fights in the game. Stage 5 feels like a turning point for Yoshi's Island. Overall, I, and many others, wouldn't consider Yoshi's Island to be a very difficult game. Even when going for 100% completion, Yoshi's Island never reaches the level of difficulty found in late stages of, say, Super Mario Bros. 3. That is, if we aren't considering the extra stages, but that's a discussion for much, much later. While the game never gets super difficult, there is still a difficulty curve, and I think Stage 5 serves as the game's first major bump in difficulty. The stage starts with disorienting its players by having it begin with platforming to the left. This may seem like a bit of an overanalyzation, but I strongly believe that this was done intentionally so as to put players on the wrong footing from the get-go. I wouldn't consider it hostile, more so cheeky. There's more too. Bottomless pits make up a majority of the stage's real estate. Its namesake, donut lifts, gradually fall away if stood on for too long, so even more of the level becomes perilous. And most importantly, this is the game's first auto-scroller. Auto-scrollers are an institution of the platformer genre, and they seem to be reviled by players for the most part. Not getting to dictate the pace of exploring the stage, along with perceived cheap deaths via the auto-scroll itself, are the chief reasons, I find. I can definitely see where people who dislike these stages are coming from, but I don't mind them as a once-in-a-while affair. Yoshi's Island features very, very few auto-scrollers, which is maybe why I'm not nearly as harsh on the concept, at least for now. One more thing I'd like to bring up before we leave this stage is a similarity I noticed between it and, of all things, the level Rainbow Cruise from Super Smash Bros. Melee. Both are auto-scrollers that resemble a C pattern in their scroll. Of course, Rainbow Cruise takes its aesthetic from the Mario 64 level Rainbow Ride, but I don't know, maybe I'm seeing a pattern that isn't actually there. This obscuring foreground effect in Stage 6 is pretty jarring to see at first. The effect looks pretty good, but I could see it getting annoying if too many stages were littered with it. I feel like it's meant to give the impression that the level is under some sort of canopy, but the background doesn't really sell that illusion. There's better examples of this later on in the game. I praised Yoshi's Island earlier for feeling like a big interconnected world, but there's many cases where that illusion gets completely shattered. A random door placed on top of a cloud isn't very unusual to see in a video game, but it gets juxtaposed with the times Yoshi's Island strives to be a little more cohesive. That is, for sure, a nitpick, but it really does feel like it comes out of nowhere. Inside of the door is a tutorial on the different egg colors. By default, Yoshi will always produce green eggs, but depending on how many times they're ricocheted against a wall, they'll change color. Once we'll change them to yellow, and twice we'll turn them red. Any more and the eggs explode, outside of some special cases where the walls allow more ricochets than usual. The point of the color change is to show what will happen when the egg collides with an object or enemy. Yellow ones produce some coins, and red ones will create bonus stars, the health of the game. This mechanic, when mastered, can prove extremely useful, especially when attempting a 100% playthrough. There's always a way to get at least 20 stars in every stage, but some stages are stingier than others, so some careless gameplay, be it getting hurt, or missing where those stars are, can lead to a redo. Red eggs provide, in theory, a perpetual star factory of sorts. That is, provided the player has the reflexes to reintegrate them into their collection with Yoshi's tongue. The eggs move at a blistering pace, so it's easier said than done sometimes. You may have noticed one final egg that I neglected to mention. That's because this blinking brown egg is not something Yoshi can naturally produce, it can only be found. A blinking egg will spawn one of the 20 red coins in the stage. This mechanic has always felt bizarre to me. There's nothing really connecting the idea of a blinking red egg to equaling a red coin, and it's far too easy to miss with the egg, completely screwing up the chance of a 100% completion. There's also no strategy involved with the blinking egg. As soon as the player finds a target, simply throw the egg to get the coin. Contrast that with the red eggs, where they can be deployed in an emergency after an accidental hit. Not to mention that I can count the amount of times these eggs are even used with one hand. That's a running theme with Yoshi's Island, though. Many concepts are dropped after only a small handful of uses. I think if I had my way with the eggs, and I couldn't remove them outright, I'd make it so they produce a spare red coin. That way, they feel like a useful backup plan if the player comes up suddenly short at the end of a stage. Something that makes this level stand out from the others, in my opinion, is how it swaps from above ground to below ground several times. There's already been a level where the cave was the main focus, so I like that this one gives the player a little bit of both to chew on. Inside of one of these underground sections is our second transformation, the mole tank. While in this transformation, Yoshi can squeeze through small passages and dig through soft ground. If I was to rank all of the transformations, I think I would put the mole tank at the absolute bottom, sorry to say. The main culprit hindering this transformation to me has to be its control. It's surprisingly unruly to use. Very frequently, I'll find myself turned around when I made no apparent changes to my control. The tank is also incredibly slow. A time limit is in play, and most of the time collectibles are hidden in these mole tank sections, and unlike the previous helicopter section, this one can't be redone. So it's incredibly frustrating to miss out on 100% completion because the tank got turned around or was too slow. It looks cool though, I'll give it that. Stage 1-7, Touch Fuzzy, Get Dizzy, is without a doubt the most iconic level in Yoshi's Island, and that's thanks to the titular enemy of the stage. Of course, the fuzzies don't show up for a little bit, so until then, I'll rattle off a few other thoughts I have on the level. This is the first stage to give us a jungle-like aesthetic. Jungles and tropical island settings go hand in hand, so this is a no-brainer for a game like Yoshi's Island. World 3 will give us plenty more jungle stages. For now, this is just a taste. There's a few new enemies outside of the fuzzies in this level, and one that piques my interest is the melon bug. They're actually incapable of directly harming Yoshi, which may disqualify them for even being considered enemies. Another unique characteristic appears when Yoshi spits them out of his mouth. They turn into a little ball that rolls through enemies. Alright, but on to the headliner. Something I always noticed when entering this section was the somewhat high drop at its outset, making it impossible to backtrack. Not that there needs to be a reason for this occurring, but I've cooked up a slapdash theory as to why this might have happened. There's a bonus stage accessible in this level via a key, and maybe the development team didn't want players entering the bonus stage while under the influence. What amazes me most about the fuzzies is how blatant their presentation is. The level's name, Touch Fuzzy, Get Dizzy, may attempt to spin this as Yoshi just being disoriented, but Yoshi's dilated pupils, the wave pattern of the world, and psychedelic colors all betray this. Yoshi is high. The Newgrounds cartoons basically wrote themselves. What makes this so iconic, I believe, is how unexpected this is. Even putting aside the obvious drug illusions, this enemy is capable of not hurting Yoshi, but impairing him. The stage doesn't have much in the way of obstacles besides the fuzzies for this section, but there are a few, and the visual impairment is sure to mess with some players. If it doesn't, then Yoshi's unpredictable back and forth sway will. Fuzzies are used very sparingly throughout the game, which I'm of two minds about. On one hand, their rare appearance makes seeing them a surprise each time. On the other hand, I don't know if the game uses them to their full potential because of their minimal time in the sun, but I'll save some of that talk for later. As for how this effect was done, you can thank the Super Nintendo's Mode 2 for that. And of course, our good old friend HDMA. Once again, the Super FX2 isn't the main contributor to Yoshi's Island's VFX magic. Despite the namesake of the stage being behind us, there's still a decent amount of level to go. This small water section may seem short, but that's only if the player isn't attempting a 100% run. Just blitzing to the end, collecting all the coins in sight will not be enough to 100% the level. There's a hidden section that can only be accessed if Yoshi jumps from the highest point of this branch, which will make a bounce block appear that allows him to find the remaining coins. The secret has always rubbed me the wrong way. It feels far too hidden even when compared to what the game asks of the player in its final stretch. I don't feel as though the branch is enough of a hint since it doesn't feel conspicuous in the environment of the level, and up to this point the game has never asked the player to jump off screen to be rewarded. It feels like a secret made to sell strategy guides, even if it's not what the developers intended. What makes this even worse is that this is still really early into the game, and an obtuse secret like this could very easily turn a player off from attempting to fully clear Yoshi's Island, which is a shame. We've reached the final stage of World 1, Salvo the Slime's Castle. The finale of each world is always a castle level, and I like that this nomenclature is used here. Every mid-world stage is a fort, while the final one is called a proper castle. This differentiation is actually not original to this game though. Super Mario World used the exact same method of naming its castle levels, with the less important optional castle stages being called fortresses. Difficulty-wise, this stage is pretty low on the scale. I'd wager that most who play the game would have more trouble with Bert's Fort than Salvo's Castle. There are some unique sights nonetheless. The most unique would probably have to be the Liquid Lift. It moves in a deterministic, counterclockwise direction, but the way it goes from being really fast to slow gives it a lot more personality, I feel. This room in general is just interesting. The sewer aesthetic is so out of place with the rest of the level. Although, I guess one could argue that a sewer aesthetic is a fitting home for a character called Salvo the Slime. That's not the end of the weirdness, though. The only things that can hurt the player in this room, direct contact with the Shy Guys and the Sprayfish, are very unlikely to. It feels like one of those classic game design techniques of introduce a mechanic in a safe environment to get players acclimated moments, but this kind of liquid lift, the one that moves all around the room, is never seen again. As a one and done, it feels unusual. After the lift room comes what could be considered the centerpiece room of the level. The player needs to navigate through these platforms that can have spikes on either side, depending on if the corresponding block has been hit. As a new mechanic, I feel this is more than adequately introduced. There's actually some interactions with these blocks that I would consider slightly more the beginner, like using eggs to hit the blocks that switches the platforms around. The boss is a little further in, and strangely enough, he has a little bit of a lead-up hallway after his boss door. A few of the bosses in this game have a lead-up to them, but it seems to be done arbitrarily. The boss, Salvo, is based off of these small slime enemies called Lemon Drops, although, unlike Bert, this is the enemy's first appearance in the game. Part of the fun of the Yoshi's Island bosses is seeing what an enemy will look like when blown up to a massive size. and I feel as though that fun isn't present if the boss is a wholly new enemy that hasn't been seen yet. Not to mention, a blob with eyes isn't particularly exciting. In case you couldn't tell, I don't think too highly of Salvo the Slime. It may look impressive, with its gradient colors portraying 3D quite well, but it's not very difficult and can't even hurt Yoshi with direct contact, unlike most enemies in the game. There's a pit of lava on the opposite side of the boss arena that could, in theory, be used by Salvo to push Yoshi into, but I've never had that happen to me in all my years of playing. I understand that it's a good idea to ease players in with a simple boss in the early game, but let's just say when it comes to boss design, it's all uphill from here. Regardless of how I feel about the bosses, defeating them always feels incredibly satisfying. The giant-ass key given to Yoshi feels reminiscent to the secret exits in Super Mario World, so even if it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, it's a nice callback. But the real star is the little animation of Yoshi walking along the overworld island and blowing up the world's castle. This is another callback, but also gives players a visual reminder that the Yoshis are traversing throughout the entire island to find Luigi. The overworld isn't totally consistent with the look of the map on the level select screen, but in most cases it's close enough and functions fine as an abstraction. If there was a more traditional world map, maybe this animation wouldn't be as meaningful to me, but since there's a more standard level select screen than, say, the overworld of Super Mario World, this feels right. World 2 gives us more green, grassy mountains as the focal point. I've heard some say it was inspired by the Pacific Northwest, the home of Nintendo of America, but I couldn't find a source for that. It's a nice thought nonetheless. As for what I think of this aesthetic, it's great. A lot of platformer games, especially Mario, will present worlds with completely contrasting themes back to back with each other. It's not exactly a bad thing, but I start to roll my eyes when I see the water world, desert world, ice world, etc. Not to imply Yoshi's Island doesn't have distinct worlds, because I think it does. They're just more gradual with it. Both this level and the levels of the first world aren't too different, but what makes them stand out are their color palettes. World 2's palette has more cool colors like blue and green, while World 1 has oranges and yellows. 2-1 is a pretty important stage, since it introduces a lot of new mechanics to the mix, one of which I'm gonna hold off on talking about for a moment. In the meantime, let's talk Koopas. They make their debut in this stage. Holding off on introducing what is probably the most iconic enemy in video games until a sixth of your game is complete might seem strange, but I really like that they did this, and I think it showed a lot of restraint. By holding off on introducing more recognizable enemies from the Mario series, it gives the original enemies more of a chance to stick in the player's head. World 2 seemed to be the floodgates for a lot of classic Mario enemies, so expect to see even more familiar faces the further we go. There's a quick segment of the stage devoted to introducing us to Poochie. Poochie is kinda like Yoshi's, well, Yoshi. However, he's a lot simpler. When Yoshi jumps onto Poochie's back, he'll run in the direction Yoshi is facing, and jump when required. Despite this simplicity, Poochie has managed to become a series staple, much like Yoshi did back in Super Mario World, albeit to a lesser extent. Yoshi had much more mechanical depth to him, but something both Poochie and Yoshi have in common are distinct, cute designs. I feel like if this was a walking platform or something, I wouldn't be as endeared to this mechanic, but since a lot of work went into giving Poochie something of a personality, I'm a fan. It reminds me of the items in Mega Man 2 compared to Rush from Mega Man 3. The items got replaced with Rush, and Rush remained in the series to this very day, and I think his design played a big part in that. According to a blurb in Nintendo Power, Poochie was a character that was created very early on in development, but didn't have much of a forged out role in the game until the 11th hour. Takashi Tezuka, co-director of Yoshi's Island and many other Super Mario games, was even quoted as saying,
"I love Poochie. He's a dog."
I remember having a lot of trouble with this section as a kid. Even today it manages to screw me up every now and then. The falling rocks seem to be staggered in a way that gives the player very little time to hop between their falls. Thankfully there are no collectibles in this section until the end, so the player can focus purely on platforming. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this part of the level makes most think of Tetris. Coincidentally, a year after Yoshi's Island was released, Yoshi starred in a puzzle game called Tetris Attack. Of course, this wasn't actually a Tetris game, but a reskin of another puzzle game called Panel de Pon, and now I'm getting completely off track. I just thought that was interesting. The one other new mechanic I refrained from discussing in the last stage also just so happens to appear in the next stage as well, so I might as well stop being coy and give it the spotlight. Super Baby Mario is a power-up that, much like the Yoshi transformations, turns the standard Yoshi's Island gameplay on its head for a short while. In this state, control shifts to Baby Mario, who, while normally is completely defenseless, becomes invincible and is also capable of running at incredibly high speeds, so high that he's able to scale even ceiling walls. The catch is that this power-up on its own is very short, so the player is encouraged to pick up the pace and run through the predetermined path, guided by even more power stars. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of this power-up, I'd like to point out that the theme that plays during this power-up's duration, while being something of an extended riff on the original Starman theme from Mario, would later be redone in Super Mario 64 as the theme for the wing cap. It's a theme that most would probably consider a Mario 64 original, but its origins actually trace back here. Baby Mario's yellow cape also feels like a nod to Super Mario World. According to an interview from 1995 with Miyamoto, the idea for Super Baby Mario started as a way to entice returning Mario players who were on the fence about playing a game with a new main character. Originally, the star was going to miraculously transform Baby Mario into his fully grown self, but this was changed to just giving Baby Mario powers after most of the team gave him feedback that seeing Mario in this form felt a little weird, something I'm inclined to believe as well. Ironically though, I also feel that with this decision to keep him as a baby, it sort of undercuts Miyamoto's original reasoning for having the power-up to begin with, as I don't think the possibility of playing as an infant version of a beloved character would have enticed 90s gamers. That said, we've had baby versions of Mario characters playable in spin-offs for almost as long as Yoshi's Island has existed, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. When it comes to Yoshi's Island's many power-ups, I think Super Baby Mario is one of the stronger ones. The short duration coupled with fast run speeds make for some exciting moments. I think it's a far stronger inclusion than any of the transformations, to say the least. The final stretch of this stage takes us through one of those outdoor cave areas. They resemble tunnel systems made by certain animals, in this case rats. And if I may be petty for a moment, I think they really should have reconsidered the sound effect used for these little buggers. The squeak is very grating on the ears and is constant. Yoshi's Island unfortunately has somewhat of a reputation for obnoxious sound design, and while this isn't its go-to example, I think it's one of the biggest offenders. Hey, unrelated question. What do you all think Gusties taste like? Considering their name and their close resemblance to some sort of ghostly bullet cloud, I'm going to assume they don't really taste like much of anything. Maybe some sort of light moisture aftertaste after swallowing a big gulp of air. In all seriousness though, the Gusties are actually a little more annoying than the average enemy. They appear so frequently and fly across the screen so quickly. It's very easy for a rogue Gusty to clip Yoshi and jeopardize a chance at 100% clear. The development team went out of their way to make sure that the Gusties weren't completely cheap though. When they initially appear, they actually travel significantly slower than normal. It's only once they've completely appeared on screen do they increase their speed. I think it works as a good warning to players who are paying attention. Every once in a while they still trip me up though. So I suppose it's a good thing that the Gusties won't be bothering me for the remainder of the level. Yes, the rest of the stage is a cavern, and the Gusties don't appear here. There's a pretty decent amount of stage left too, I'd say about 2/3 or so. It kind of begs the question as to why they would make the literal face of the stage amount to what is basically the appetizer. I don't even think it would have been too difficult to incorporate the Gusties underground. The level itself feels sort of forgettable to me because their flagship enemy is hardly in it, so it should come as no surprise then that I'm going to be moving on from this stage shortly. But before I do, I would like to point out a few more things, like the superstar that's used here. To this day, I have still not managed to figure out its intended use. There's marked blocks later in the level that imply that the player can take this power-up all the way to the end of the stage, but if you ask me how, I'd scratch my head and shrug my shoulders. It wouldn't be too much of use to me anyway, since I'd have to ignore plenty of red coins and flowers to retain the power-up. Finally, there's this Digger Yoshi section that's also totally devoid of any necessary collectibles. For now, let's get out of here so I can go back to talking about a more interesting stage. Bigger Boo's Fort takes a page from Stage 2-1's book and marks the return of another classic Mario enemy, the Boo. Surprised? Boos were introduced in Super Mario Bros. 3, and they were unique among the Mario Rogues gallery due to the fact that they were very difficult to kill. Only a Koopa Shell, Power Star, or the rare Hammer Bros suit could do the trick. In Yoshi's Island, though, they can be dispatched in a much simpler way, by hitting them with an egg while they aren't hiding their face. I think this is a cool example of how Yoshi's different kit can lead to some situations that are a lot easier to overcome when compared to playing as Mario. As someone who has played many Mario games, I can attest to the feeling of effortlessly defeating the Boos in Yoshi's Island as being satisfying. Unlike the first two boss levels, I feel as though this stage goes to the effort of making itself distinct in a certain way. Its aesthetic is the same as Bert's stage, but the design philosophy is not. Bigger Boo's Fort attempts to capture the puzzle-solving nature seen in the ghost houses of Super Mario World. The path that leads further into the level gets blocked by these stairs, but only by creating these steps can Yoshi make any progress to begin with. So there's this huge wraparound that needs to be done before the player can return to this room from a higher altitude, which means they don't need the stairs anymore and they're welcome to continue the stage. I also like that almost all of the enemies in this stage are ghosts, just to really bring the theme home. There's even a few Boos that appear in one specific room of the stage and never appear again. This is surprisingly a trend with some of the enemies in Yoshi's Island. No, that wasn't an editing trick. This is actually the next room in the fort. When I was younger, I was too wowed by the faux 3D look of this section to really question anything about it, but these days I find them to be jarring. These pre-rendered 3D sections feel like they were born out of compromise. We know that there was a push from management at Nintendo to make Yoshi's Island look like Donkey Kong Country, and perhaps this is what the environments would have looked like with the Yoshi model from the opening traversing them. These sections could have also been made to look this way as an eye-catcher for magazines. Maybe these reads are too cynical. For all we know, these areas could exist simply because the developers wanted to put them in. Without an interview or something, there's no definitive way to know. I don't think it hurts to speculate, though. The name Bigger Boo is likely yet another reference to Super Mario World, where there was a mini-boss in one of the ghost houses named Big Boo. Are you sick of me referencing Super Mario World, by the way? I promise I'm going somewhere with this, so hold your frustration in for now. Anyway, they weren't really kidding with the name. Bigger Boo might just be the second largest boss in the entire game, and he only gets bigger the more he's hit. This large sprite is once again done using HDMA, by the way. All that said, size doesn't equal difficulty. Bigger Boo is a massive pushover, especially if the player enters the boss fight with a full suite of eggs to throw. It makes me wonder if it wouldn't have been a bad idea to remove Yoshi's eggs before a boss fight. Almost every boss has a unique way to collect eggs, but this mechanic can be circumvented for many of them if Yoshi came prepared. Maybe one could argue that being prepared in that way should be rewarded somehow, but I'm not sure. It's never not a bad idea to have eggs, so there isn't really any sort of risk being taken. Next stage introduces us to yet another returning enemy from the mainline Mario series, the Lakitu. I'm beginning to notice a trend here. Lakitus were one of the more annoying enemies in their debut game. Their high altitude made it so they were nigh untouchable, and they'd end up pestering Mario for a majority of the level. However, as Mario's kit increased with subsequent entries, Lakitus began to lose a bit of their edge, and much like the Boos, Yoshi has an easier time getting rid of them, thanks to the tongue's long range. The tongue is by far the easiest way to dispose of them, but it yields no reward. The most difficult way to defeat Lakitu has always been to jump on them, so doing so in this game allows Yoshi to ride on its cloud, much like in Super Mario World. It doesn't feel as rewarding as it does in that game though, since Yoshi's movement is very fast and fluid to begin with. It's still nice to have though. The biggest threat in this level would probably have to be the geometry itself, or lack thereof. Long stretches of stage are composed of little to no sturdy ground to walk on. Instead, Yoshi walks across the soft dirt that's been seen several times by now. The dirt can be walked on just fine, but can be destroyed with ease. Jumping into it, firing an egg in its direction, and lastly, ground pounds all eliminate the stuff. Ground pounding in particular is a very dangerous move to use in this stage, since once the move is initiated, there's no way to cancel it. so what might have been an innocuous mispress can spell death. This is something they actually prey on. There's a part in the stage where a wooden crate stands on top of some soft dirt. If one wasn't thinking clearly, they may try to ground pound it without even realizing it would spell their doom. There's something amusing about that thought, admittedly, but maybe there should have been a way to cancel a ground pound before it actually happens, so in case of a mispress, there's a small window of time before the player really screws themselves over. Personally, I don't find myself ground pounding accidentally, so maybe I'm getting worked up over nothing here. To 100% this level, the player will need to get the key inside of that wooden crate I just discussed. Inside of the room the key grants access to is the first showcase of another new transformation, the train. The train can move and jump like normal, but what makes it stand out is its ability to shrink in size and traverse along train tracks in the background. These decals had been seen throughout the level so far, which I feel makes for some decent foreshadowing. The train's gimmick doesn't hinder control in any way, and basically only amounts to finding the correct path, so maybe it's because of its simplicity that I think it's one of the stronger transformations. Something that's odd with the train though is its inclusion of a run button. If the player holds down the Y button, they'll move faster than if they're not. In any other Mario game this wouldn't stand out, but Yoshi can reach his top speed just by holding down a direction on the D-pad. While I'm on this subject, I'd like to gush for a moment about this. I love this streamlining of controls. Sure, Yoshi's Island had the controller real estate to feature a run button, and it certainly uses the controller space allotted to it better than Super Mario World did. But if Yoshi's Island used any more of the face buttons, it would be a very uncomfortable game to play. The way a thumb rests naturally on a controller gives it easy access to 2 of the face buttons at once. Yoshi's Island uses 3 of the buttons already, but since using Yoshi's tongue and throwing eggs isn't possible at the same time, it means that the player will never have to resort to using a ridiculous control scheme like the claw. A run button is wholly unnecessary in this game, and would blaze the trail for many of the future 3D Mario games which lack a run button as well. When it comes to cave levels in video games, I usually have a hard time remembering them, which is why I find it interesting that 2-6 is such a memorable level to me. I think I have to give credit to this opening section, which is admittedly not even a cave. If the player were so inclined, they could hold down on the ground pound and crash to the soft dirt for a few good seconds. When fully completing a level, this may seem like a bad idea, as there's plenty of collectibles to find in this beginning section, but it actually isn't as ill-advised as one might think. At the bottom of the hole are some large spring balls that'll take Yoshi high enough to collect everything. Is what I would say if there weren't those 2 pesky red coins near the top of the hole. They're too high for the spring balls. It's strange that all of this accommodation at the beginning is undercut by those. The cave portion of this stage is more non-linear, which might also contribute to its memorability. If you look at a map, it's a very compact locale, with plenty of nooks and crannies that are necessary to discover for reasons I hope are obvious by now. This is one of the levels that I had to redo because, if you can believe it, I missed one of those nooks. Or maybe it was a cranny. This room, right here. Defeating all of the enemies in this room rewards the player with 4 red coins and a flower. I point this out because it's pretty unusual for Yoshi's Island to reward red coins in this manner. There are definitely examples outside of the stage, but most of the time red coins are hidden in plain sight throughout the level. Just something to keep in mind. Lakitu's Wall is a personal favorite level of mine, and the reason why might not be immediately apparent. Because despite the name of the stage drawing attention to the Lakitu, another enemy introduced in this stage manages to completely overshadow them. No pun intended. The amount of care that went into the giant Shy Guy should be highlighted, and if a video that commentates over the entirety of Yoshi's Island wasn't going to do that, I don't know why I would even bother making it. Jumping on the giant Shy Guys doesn't work, as Yoshi will bounce right off of them. All jumping will accomplish is cause them to break out into a run, on the red ones at least. Their run/walk cycle is something special too. Their bodies jiggle a little to match their gait. I found that to be so amusing when I first noticed it. The real appeal of the giant Shy Guys, though, comes from Yoshi eating them. Fitting their large stature, eating a giant Shy Guy causes Yoshi to produce an equally large egg. These large eggs have completely different properties when compared to regular eggs. Due to its size, Yoshi will stumble back and forth when aiming it, and when it's finally thrown, it won't fly too far. So direct hits aren't exactly easy with these eggs, but That doesn't matter, because the shockwave these eggs produce when hitting the ground are so strong they defeat every enemy on screen. They're not strong enough to destroy soft dirt though, which seems a little odd. It's a very simple idea, but it's very fun to use these eggs. It's one of the few instances of Yoshi's Island playing around with the egg throwing mechanic. There's a couple of limitations to the eggs. Yoshi can only carry 3 of them at a time. Not just that, but when 3 of these eggs are being carried, the game stops spawning the large Shy Guys. I have to wonder if this is some sort of memory limitation, or maybe an intentional stopgap to prevent players from spamming the eggs. Not for balancing reasons, but because the eggs seem to cause problems when used in slightly out-of-the-box ways. Disappointingly, when the level is completed, all of the giant eggs are taken away. Although, there is a bug that allows Yoshi to take these eggs to other levels. I think they wanted to restrict all these eggs because of their interesting effects that will be showcased shortly. These giant eggs are the reason this stage is one of my favorites, but I do lament that this is the only stage that lets Yoshi collect giant eggs. The giant eggs are some of the least used gimmicks in the entire game, which adds insult to injury. I totally would have preferred a second section to use these things over a transformation section or something. When I said I'd showcase the weirdness with the giant egg shortly, I meant it. Watch this. I first discovered this bug when I was working through my practice run and happened to throw a giant egg while hitting a message block at the same time. I started recording after the fact, so I didn't get the beginning of the glitch on video. Thankfully, this bug seems pretty easy to replicate. I'm afraid I couldn't even begin to explain what's happening here. It seems as though the message box got trapped in the background layer after it was supposed to disappear because of whatever effect the giant eggs produce. It's purely a cosmetic bug, but bug is a bug. This is mere speculation, but perhaps this glitch is why the giant eggs are seldom seen outside of controlled environments. The rest of this level serves as a showcase for the newest transformation, the car. There's very few collectibles left, making this section very low stakes. Normally I'd pass that off as a tutorial for the mechanic, but the car, like the giant eggs, only appears in this one stage. In a vacuum, I don't necessarily have any problems with the car, but I don't find it to be too remarkable either. It also never appearing again means its only mark in the game is totally unnoteworthy. The final stage of World 2 is called the Potted Ghost's Castle, and already something's off. You see, every fort and castle stage is named after the boss who resides in it. The only exception, in both English and Japanese, is this stage. The Japanese name for this stage translates to, "Push Forward, the Pot Ghost." This came as a bit of a shock to me because the boss of this castle does have a name. It's Roger. Roger the Potted Ghost. But you would only know that if you read any of Yoshi's Island's supplementary material, because it's not in the game at all. I have 2 theories as to why that is. I'll lead with the less likely one. There was a character limit and they couldn't fit Roger's name. If the name of the stage was Roger the Potted Ghost's Castle, that would add up to about 30 characters, including spaces and punctuation. And none of the other level names reach that number. You get pretty close though, but I think the real reason is that the name Roger was made up after localization. I think this is the case because out of all of the bosses in the original Japanese version, Roger is the only one without a proper name. He's merely referred to as Subo Obake, which just translates to Pot Ghost. Why he went nameless in the Japanese version, I can't say, but I theorize that the name Roger was created late in localization or after localization was completed, so every boss in Yoshi's Island would have a proper name. Roger has barely appeared outside of this game, but he was a spirit in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, where he remains Roger, so it appears the name stuck. While I wouldn't say that this stage carries a consistent theme throughout, it does have some recurring elements. A few of the roadblocks, for instance, require pushing a flower pot off of a cliff face to obtain the key hidden inside. Both times there are different enemies trying to hinder the player. The first of which are these ghost guys that are perched all in a row at the ceiling. They'll pass a bomb to each other and drop it when Yoshi is in the line of fire. It's surprisingly easy for these missiles to hit Yoshi, despite how telegraphed it is. It can also be annoying to deal with while doing tasks that require Yoshi to move slowly, like pushing the flower pots. That's why I like the addition of a certain trick to stop the ghost guys in their tracks. By ground pounding, Yoshi can cause whichever ghost guy holding the missile to drop it, whether Yoshi is below him or not. It's a really intuitive use of the ground pound. I'd like this mechanic even if it was only that, but hilariously the Yoshi's Island team added more flourish to it. Once the missile is dropped, the ghost guy responsible holds his head in shame while the rest shake their heads. This is just one of the many examples of Yoshi's Island giving its enemies some semblance of a personality, and it's very much welcome. Right before the boss is this room filled with nothing but potted plants, so the boss of the stage really gets rubbed in our noses beforehand. It's never really a secret what the bosses of the fortresses and castles will be, but Roger makes me wonder if maybe they should have been. If the bosses' identities were kept secret, I don't think players would have been able to guess that the boss of this level would be a souped-up version of the pots they'd been breaking for the entire stage. It's a minor thing, and the reveal is still pretty funny, even with the element of surprise gone, but still. The fortress bosses and castle bosses each sport different themes. I find the fortress boss theme to be a much more playful tune, whereas the castle boss theme comes across as more serious. Which makes sense in my mind, as the castle bosses are the finale to a world, so the stakes should be raised. With all that said, the contrast between the serious boss theme and the boss that is Roger the Potted Ghost only stands to make the boss seem that much more silly. He's probably the easiest boss in the entire game. The only way I could ever conceive of someone dying against Roger is if they left the game on idle for a minute or two. Roger can't exactly attack Yoshi directly outside of the fire he occasionally spits out. The danger, and I use that term very loosely, comes from his two Shy Guy goons that push Roger towards Yoshi. Players will have been practicing defeating Roger throughout the entire castle, so by merely holding right and relenting when the fire draws near, Yoshi can send both the Shy Guys and Roger falling to their doom. It's actually pretty entertaining to only push the two Shy Guys off while Roger just kinda sits there defenseless. It may be a cakewalk, but it more than makes up for it in its humor, which feels like a good note to end World 2 on. It took until World 3 for it to happen, but we finally got into the jungle-themed world. Of course, we had a level or two here and there with this aesthetic, but now Yoshi's Island is diving into the deep end. I think waiting a little while to use one of the most obvious aesthetics for a tropical island makes the setting of Yoshi's Island feel like an earnest exploration of everything that can be done with a tropical island. If the first world was all jungle levels, maybe the remaining locations will feel like an, okay, what's next sort of scenario. Speaking of, notice anything interesting about the background here? It's huge, you can't really miss it. The sun appears to be peeking through the clouds, and the colors used for the skyline are a bunch of blues with some reds closer to the middle of the sun. Obviously this effect would look better if the image was softened via a CRT, but that's a whole can of worms that can be discussed at another time. What I'm getting at is this is meant to simulate a sunrise. On its own, that's not too impressive or anything, but check out the backgrounds in the previous level. If you already caught this beforehand, then bravo, I only managed to catch this when reviewing footage. The previous stage had the sun setting in the background, and later had it resemble nighttime. Now that continuity is maintained in World 3 with this sunrise. This is another example of the amount of care and detail that went into making Yoshi's Island feel like one big world instead of a bunch of disconnected levels. I do wonder how many people even caught this though. I didn't catch it because I took breaks in between completing worlds, and I think most casual players do the same. The end of a world is the prime time to put the game down and play it later, giving time to forget about certain tertiary details. I'm glad I finally noticed this connection, but I'm a little disappointed in myself that it took me years to do so. Let's keep that ball rolling and discuss the background some more. Check out this cloud peeking out through the background. Nick Thorpe of Games Radar did a retrospective on Yoshi's Island, and in that interview, Shigefume Hino, the original character designer of Yoshi and one of the 4 directors of Yoshi's Island, explained that the art style for this game took a long time to nail down. The final attempt at pitching a style was Hino drawing a scribbly cloud. The team liked the aesthetic, and so the identity of Yoshi's Island having this hand-drawn pastel look was finally cemented. There are several scribbly-looking clouds in Yoshi's Island besides this one in question, In fact, we have no way of knowing that the cloud in question even made it into the final game. That said, I'd like to believe this cloud drawing is the very same one Hino is talking about. Even if it's not, it gave me an excuse to bring up this piece of development history. Knowing that the aesthetic of Yoshi's Island was made in such a back-to-the-wall situation is fascinating. 3.1 introduces us to Grinders, these little monkey enemies. Grinders are a pretty strange enemy for a couple of reasons. Their name has been retconned, for starters. These days they're known as Ukikis, which came about with the monkey enemy introduced in Super Mario 64. I'm much more fond of the name Ukiki, so I'll be using that name from now on. Ukiki sounds sort of like the noise monkeys make, which gives some sort of logic to the name. Why they should be called Grinders is anyone's guess. Something else that bothers me about these enemies is an inconsistency with their design. In-game, I find them to be quite cute. They're doing that little cat face. But when you compare it to their concept art, it looks more like weird skin flaps over their faces. Inconsistencies between concept art and sprites is far from unique. It's even possible the concept art was created after the sprite. I only bring it up because the concept art design was apparently the preferred look, as the skin flaps have carried over all the way into the modern day. I think the strangest aspect to the Ukikis are their unique in-game properties. They're very much unlike other enemies. Nintendo surprisingly made the Ukikis behave in a convincingly animalistic way. They'll frantically hop and run away from Yoshi as if they're startled, and even eat fruit like watermelon. Of course, I don't think they were necessarily going for realism here. After all, they also hang from tops of trees dropping missiles and swing back and forth like they're part of that Barrel of Monkeys toy. But even those few unique traits are enough to make the Ukiki stand out, as well as be incredibly annoying. Stage 3-2 introduces us to yet another new enemy, the Spear Guy. I believe this is the 6th or so proper variant of the Shy Guy scene, so now seems like a good time to bring up the Fuji TV-sized elephant in the room. Nowadays, Shy Guys are just another common rogue in the Mario series gallery, but that wasn't always the case. Shy Guys originate from the Western Super Mario Bros. 2, which wasn't a Mario game at all, but a different platformer made by the core Mario team called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic. This is Gaming Trivia 101, so I don't feel the need to explain much further. My point is this. The appearance of anything in the Western Super Mario Bros. 2 was dubious at best in consideration to the greater Mario canon. That was, until the release of Yoshi's Island. Yoshi's Island's proliferation of the Shy Guy and a few other enemies was the stepping stone in making the Western Super Mario Bros. 2 essential to the Mario universe. Soon after, we would see Shy Guys and eventually Birdo appear in the Mario spin-off titles. I have to wonder why Shy Guys were chosen by the development team to be such a frequent enemy in Yoshi's Island. We'll never know definitively, but perhaps the fact that Hideki Kono worked on both Doki Doki Panic and Yoshi's Island might have something to do with it. When replaying Yoshi's Island, this particular developer message really caught me by surprise. Developer messages like this aren't uncommon in games, but they're usually fairly hidden or only appear near the end. Meanwhile, this one is out in the open a little under halfway through. It feels somewhat personal too for how short it is. Its placement really puzzles me, but it does give me an opportunity to discuss the development of Yoshi's Island. Nintendo is notoriously tight-lipped about their process, but thankfully there's been a few interviews with key staff members who worked on Yoshi's Island over the years. One interview that I found to be quite illuminating was done to promote the Super Nintendo Classic Edition back in 2017. The interview featured Takashi Tezuka, the co-director of the Mario series, Shigefumi Hino, the character designer for Yoshi, and Hisashi Nogami, a character designer for Yoshi's Island. The most fascinating nugget of info from this interview comes from an anecdote Hino and Nogami shared when developing the game. According to them, when the N64 was a year out from release, key members from their staff, including their then director Hideki Kono, was taken off of the project. At that point, Super Mario 64 was the all-hands-on-deck title, and because of that, Yoshi's Island's cardinal staff was reduced to Hino, Nogami, and one unnamed designer, along with programming assistants from SRD, a support studio that assisted Nintendo with projects as far back as the original Super Mario Bros. 4 people are credited as director for Yoshi's Island: Shigefumi Hino, Hideki Kono, Takashi Tezuka, and finally Toshihiko Nagako, who works for SRD, which backs up what Hino says in this interview. It should be noted that when Hino said the Nintendo 64 was a year out, he was likely approximating. because he mentions that while the framework on Yoshi's Island was finished, the game was far from done. With Yoshi's August 1995 release date, a year back from the N64's release would be a mere 2-month period where the game had a skeleton staff. Not to get too into the specific avenue of discussion, but there exists a leaked pre-release build of the game dated back to late June that is near finished, so we're likely looking at several months where Yoshi's Island was handled by a minuscule team outside of SRD. With this knowledge in mind, it gives me a different perspective on certain aspects of Yoshi's Island's design. Yoshi's Island was in development for about 4 years, which these days is practically standard but borderline unheard of back in 1995. It reportedly took a long time for Yoshi's Island to resemble the game we know and love, and much of the chief staff was removed from the project months before release. With these facts in mind, I feel it's fair to declare that Yoshi's Island had a turbulent development cycle. Parts of Yoshi's Island feel, to me, like the direct result of these management decisions, and I'll be sure to point them out when I see them. This stage actually may be a little more significant than it may appear. I believe this is the stage that inspired the Western box art for the game. Here are the bushes, and of course this first section features the Nepinut, which also appears on the cover. The Blarg and the Nepinut are probably some of the most memorable enemies of Yoshi's Island, thanks in no small part to their large stature. They were very intimidating to me as a kid, but nowadays all that large size does is serve as a giant target. The Blarg, the red lava counterpart, actually may surprise some of you to learn that they aren't originally from Yoshi's Island, but instead debuted in Super Mario World. Although if you ask me, it's in name only, since they look completely different there. The Nepinut is technically the recolor, since the Blarg not only appeared in an earlier Mario title, albeit in name only, but it also appeared earlier in the game. Despite that though, I find the Nepinut to be the more recognizable of the two because of its appearance on the box art. So for us Americans, we see the Nepinut before we even put the game in the console. Of course, this is all ignoring the fact that in Japanese, both enemies are called Blarg anyway. I feel like I've lost the plot a bit. The second area of this stage introduces us to yet another unique egg type, although this one is more unique than eggs but larger. Huffin' Puffins are these goofy little ducks that have their kids following them in a line. Disturbing their run allows Yoshi to take its offspring and use them for target practice, which sounds way more morbid than it actually is in practice. When Yoshi throws these guys, they go towards their target and eventually boomerang back to do it all over again. As funny as it is to see Yoshi toss these fellas around, I don't normally employ their handiwork outside of sheer curiosity. The boomerang effect is useful in theory, but I find that the children don't travel far enough away from Yoshi, or they end up hitting a wall on the return. They may be more unique and cuter than the giant eggs, but they aren't nearly as useful. The submarine appears shortly after this section, rounding out the transformations. Yoshi's Island actually features no underwater levels, an institution in the Mario series since Super Mario Bros. Yoshi will float to the surface of water, meaning there aren't even underwater mechanics for Yoshi to take advantage of outside of this submarine transformation. If I had to guess as to why underwater levels didn't make an appearance in Yoshi's Island, I would point to the egg throwing. It probably would have seemed strange to have Yoshi throw eggs at the regular velocity underwater as he did on land. And if you change the eggs to function in a more realistic fashion, they would feel horrible to use. Maybe even Baby Mario and his erratic movement when off Yoshi's back complicated things. I'd sooner point towards the eggs though. It's worth mentioning that Yoshi's Island's follow-up, Yoshi's Story, did feature underwater stages, but they prevented the use of eggs entirely in them. That game is also quite different from Yoshi's Island, to say the least. If you asked me what my least favorite transformation was as a kid, I probably would have pointed towards the submarine. These days though, I'm less tepid towards it, and in my most recent playthrough, came out of it thinking fairly highly of it. I believe it's unique enough to justify its inclusion, unlike the car or even the mole tank. It even has a few edges over the helicopter, like hits being less punishing or self-defense in the form of homing missiles. It shares the same flaw though, being unruly to control. With this being the final transformation, I think that's a better time than ever to give them the dress down that some of you probably saw coming since the second level of the game. The transformations feel like they should be a pivotal part of the core gameplay of Yoshi's Island. As a whole, they certainly show up enough to give off that impression, but I can never shake the feeling throughout this playthrough that they were unnecessary. I guess the problem is that the levels never really do anything that exciting with them after they're introduced. They don't evolve, barring a few exceptions. One of which can be found in this very stage, where the helicopter is used as a sort of key to solve a puzzle, but those are very few and far between. In addition to that though, many of the transformations, such as the submarine, only get used a couple of times at most. After this stage, the submarine is only used 2 more times after its debut. What really surprises me though is that these transformations ended up becoming a staple of the series. Yoshi's Island is constantly throwing new ideas at the wall and seeing what sticks. Where I and the game differ though is where the transformations ended up after everything was said and done. I'm going to skip ahead a little to the next submarine section in Prince Froggy's fort. Not to necessarily talk about the submarine, I feel like I've said enough about that. No, I want to bring attention to a strange quirk that is present in all of Yoshi's Island, but happens to be more noticeable in the submarine, due to all of the coins in this section having a slightly darker sheen to their color. This darker sheen, if you were paying attention, has been present since the beginning of the game, and all red coins can be seen sporting this color before being picked up. So, perceptive players that can tell the difference between these darker colored coins and regular coins should always know when they're going to pick up a red coin. There was clearly a lot of care put into the readability of red coins, so players always knew that they had one picked up, what with that shrill noise they make, as well as the coin's true appearance when collected. There's even a unique noise that's made when the final red coin is picked up. I believe that the idea of red coins being discernible from regular coins was completely and totally intentional. And that's great. So why am I dwelling on this then? Well, some might have already noticed, but for those unaware, I'm afraid that this readability is inconsistent, to put it lightly. Red coins always have this darker sheen, yes, but not all coins with this darker sheen are red coins. For instance, all coins seen underwater feature this sheen, red coin or not. There's also more examples, although they're more nebulous to me. All I could find was the Mario Wiki claiming some enemies produce these fake red coins when defeated. I have to believe that these fake red coins are an incredibly unfortunate bug. This might be overly dramatic, but this bug annoys me greatly, because it adds uncertainty to the red coin process that in all other areas is absolute. I would love to heap loads of praise on Yoshi's Island for using both audio and visual cues to assist the player in finding red coins, but this one bug spoils the whole pot for me. Out of all of the fortress and castle stages, I think Prince Froggy's fort makes the best first impression when it comes to the visuals. The sunset background obscured by the rich canopy is a real treat to see. Later on, once Yoshi enters the fortress proper, the fog begins to roll in, which serves as the wedding topper to this visual feast. The fortress music complements this stage very nicely, as if there wasn't enough to love already. I think I feel safe in declaring this the most visually impressive stage in the game. Everything just comes together so well. I wish I could say the same about the design, but I can't. Prince Froggy's fort is a fairly boring stage, thanks in no small part to a significant portion of it being devoted to moving on a slow, rotating group of platforms that need to be carried across a body of water if the player wants to collect everything in the level. I'm sure someone extremely skilled with their flutter kick timing and egg throwing could probably ditch the platform altogether, but I'm no speedrunner, and neither are a majority of the player base, so I think this warrants bringing up. Inversely, however, this stage's boss is one of the most interesting in the game. By this point, the player is expected to know the routine for the boss fights. Kamek appears, says something, and casts a spell on a common enemy to make them large and intimidating. Now, just because it's a routine doesn't make it boring, since there's always a question of which enemy will get the boss treatment that brings some semblance of excitement all on its own. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be occasions where expectations are subverted, and this is one of the first of few examples Yoshi's Island has. Kamek, instead of making Prince Froggy grow, shrinks Yoshi down and gives him a taste of his own medicine. I doubt this was meant to feel very existential and was merely meant as an interesting boss arena, but the parallel is there. Fighting inside of Prince Froggy's stomach is off-putting. The arena appears to stretch and contort to Yoshi's weight, but the movement remains unchanged, which can give off a bit of a disconnect. It's also the smallest boss arena in the game, meaning dodging can prove a bit precarious. Finally, there's how you defeat Froggy. Just wait for the once normal-sized Shy Guys to appear in his belly with Yoshi, and create the reappearing giant eggs, aiming for the uvula at the top of the screen. Keeping towards the middle of the arena and aiming up sidesteps the giant egg's quirky aiming, so after everything is said and done, the fight isn't too tough, just different. Froggy's hit total isn't much different from previous bosses like Bigger Boo, but unlike that fight, this one usually sticks around longer, because the egg supply is dictated by the boss. Any eggs brought into the boss room are lost once the fight begins, so it can't be cheesed like Bigger Boo can. I like how the pace is controlled here. This is clearly the most unique boss fight seen thus far, and I think it would be a shame if players could roll through it in mere seconds like some other bosses. Once the fight is finished, Yoshi and Mario compartmentalize their shared trauma of being shit out of a frog and move on to the next stage. The premise of 3-5 is coincidentally similar to 2-5's, at least for the opening section. Long stretches of breakable ground with enemies at a high altitude. Only this time the stakes have been rightfully ratcheted up. For one, the Ukikis and their missiles are able to destroy all of the soft dirt on their own, unlike the Lakitus. These missiles have a deceptively large hitbox, or at least that's what I like to tell myself to explain why I get hit by them all the time. You didn't think I was joking earlier about the missile thing, did you? Skipping a little further ahead in the stage, there's this section where Yoshi has to platform across the tops of trees. At the bottom, there's a few tricky jumps that lead to a secret area. There's nothing distinct about that, that's basically the ethos of Yoshi's Island's level design, intricate levels with collectibles scattered throughout. Which is precisely my problem with secret areas like this. The purpose of the secret stage is strictly to collect extra lives by training the player's target practice against a multitude of fly guys. Ignoring any greater discussion to be had on lives for now, I feel disappointed when I discover one of these secret areas for one simple fact. Lives are not collectibles. A high life total is not required to 100% this game. I feel as though any of these secret areas that's only purpose is to accrue lives is a waste of my time. The thing is, this might not have bothered me as much as it does if these areas were consistent. There's that word again. Some of these do, in fact, hide collectibles, so there's no way to tell for the first time what kind of secret area I'm wading into until it's already done. While I'm speaking about the collectibles, allow me to posit a sort of pet theory I had about them. I theorized that each different type of collectible was meant to represent a different pillar of Yoshi's Island's game design. The stars represent player skill, getting from the beginning to the end of the stage while taking minimal or in some cases no damage. The red coins represent exploration. Scouring the stages vigilantly will lead to finding where they're hidden. Finally, there's the flowers, which rewarded puzzle solving. Remedial puzzles such as angling an egg correctly or defeating every enemy in the room, but puzzles nonetheless. At the time, I found that to be an interesting observation, but there's a reason I'm speaking about it in past tense. When held under scrutiny, it doesn't really hold together. The delineation of the role flowers and red coins serve is not nearly as rigid as I hypothesized. There's plenty of examples where flowers can be found via exploration, and same goes for red coins, where they're the reward for solving puzzles, as nebulous as that definition is. Maybe there isn't anything big outside of point total that separates the red coins and flowers mechanically, but I prefer this method as opposed to, say, one more flower or no flowers at all. In games like these, where collectibles are a driving force behind the gameplay, I find it far too common that a game will start to completely shower a player with baubles, which really overwhelms me and leaves me super disappointed if I'm missing a small handful of them. Inversely, games that merely dip their toes in this subgenre don't end up going far enough with the concept to truly unlock their potential. Yoshi's Island has a great middle ground, where the collectible total is standard for every level. They just get hidden better as a means of upping the stakes. The Cave of Hairy Hedgehog has a few nuggets to chew on. Before we get to the titular enemy, I want to point out the background used for this cave section. I find it interesting how domesticated it is. There are these bioluminescent lights, which go a long way to explain how this cave isn't obscured by darkness, if there even needed to be an explanation. But taking an even closer look at one reveals that they resemble streetlights. It doesn't end there though. Littered throughout the background are 6-paned half-circle windows. It gives the impression that this area, more so than any cave before it, is a civilization. I wonder if there were more grander plans for this background. It could also be trying to imply that this cave we enter is something of a house to this new enemy, Hairy Hedgehog. Mechanically, this enemy isn't all that interesting, but his appearance certainly is. This hedgehog enemy sporting blue quills feels more than coincidentally similar to one video game rival mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. As years pass by, the landscape of the video game industry in the 90s will feel more and more like ancient history. On the off chance you're watching this and aren't aware of that time, allow me to give a very brief recap. Nintendo's reign was meaningfully challenged for the first time in the early 90s by rival company Sega and their mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. Both Sega and Nintendo would frequently reference each other via advertisement campaigns and even in-game cameos. So Yoshi's Island creating an enemy with a few similarities to Sonic the Hedgehog isn't all that odd. However, this might not be as cut and dry as it appears. In the Japanese guidebook for Yoshi's Island, Hairy Hedgehog is referred to as Super Porcupo. What's a Porcupo? Well, that just so happens to be the name of this enemy from the Western Super Mario Bros. 2. The resemblance is uncanny, and it wouldn't be the first instance of Yoshi's Island fostering enemies from that game. It's also worth mentioning that Porcupo's color seems to change between purple and blue depending on where you look. I'd be silly to suggest it wasn't blue in this game, though. And despite this new information, I can't throw out the possibility that this enemy was repurposed because of its resemblance to Sonic. We could be dealing with a little bit of both scenario. Nonetheless, it's an interesting rabbit hole. Speaking of holes, I want to highlight this pipe that's conspicuously placed at the end of this cave. At first glance, this appears to be yet another pipe dedicated to spitting out enemies for the purpose of refilling Yoshi's egg reserves. Several of these can be seen throughout the game, and going inside any of them treats the player to a small isolated area similar to the vases of Super Mario Bros. 2, where they can eat the incoming enemies faster. But this specific one is different. Inside of it is a timed challenge and the final flower that's required to finish the level. I just spent the previous stage getting worked up over inconsistency, so I won't rehash myself so soon after the fact. This still frustrated me though, because by this point in game I figured all of these areas were the same and they didn't require checking. Yoshi's Island is almost a wild west of design rules, almost as if no two stages follow the same syllabus. In certain games that might be a boon, but an exploration platformer such as Yoshi's Island, I feel it hinders it. I'm loath to discuss genre distinctions, but I always seem to find myself brushing up against the subject whether I like it or not. As hard as people seem to try, there always seems to be that pesky old subjectivity that creeps in when trying to box games into specific genre titles. For instance, both Yoshi's Island and Super Mario Bros. Could be considered platformer games, but that name doesn't really prepare you for the world of difference the two games have. You could get more specific, but then you alienate people with your word salad of a genre name. There needs to be a middle ground. I don't claim to have found the solution, but over the course of examining Yoshi's Island, I've grown comfortable with distinguishing it from its Mario predecessors by referring to it as an exploration platformer, where I would classify older Mario titles as athletic platformers, as a nod to Miyamoto's original vision for the game. In both games, running and jumping are at their core, but Yoshi's Island is more about absorbing in the stage and examining it for all the secrets hidden inside, hence the exploration and exploration platformer. We're almost at the halfway marker, so I'm sure some are wondering how long I'm gonna go without mentioning Baby Mario's cry. It might just be the most well-known aspect of Yoshi's Island. Ever since its release, the cry has been the subject of much discussion, usually coming to the conclusion that the crying, with its incessant high-pitched whine and shocking similarity to an actual baby's cry, is bad and shouldn't have been in the game. There even exist modifications of the game that wholesale remove the cry. Even Nintendo's official magazine couldn't help but throw in a jab at the sound's expense. This may come as a surprise to hear after some of the criticisms I've levied towards this game, or maybe not considering this video exists, but I truly don't believe the cry is all that bad. Would I want to hear it on loop for 12 hours? Absolutely not, but to do that would completely rob it of its context in game. Think about it. The cry only occurs when Yoshi has been hit and Baby Mario is in danger. For most players, it's only heard for a few seconds at a time, and the more experienced they are, the less it's heard. It's theoretically possible to never even hear the infamous Baby Mario cry on a proficient enough playthrough. It's a sound meant to elicit urgency in the player. Get that baby back right away, or there will be consequences. I also think it gives Baby Mario personality. Of course he would cry, right? The fact that the noise can end up being so infrequent makes me appreciate it more than the constant low health droning seen in a litany of other games. You're welcome to disagree, but I think that mouse sound effect heard a while ago is much more annoying. This stage basically came and went with me not talking about it at all. Sometimes there isn't much to discuss in a stage, and I think until the end, Monkey's favorite lake is one of those levels. The final stretch features an incredibly deadly enemy lurking in the water, which I can certainly spare a few words on. The lungefish functions similarly to the Big Bertha enemy from Super Mario Bros. 3. Both enemies leap out of the water and swallow the player whole, instantly defeating them. There are a few changes to the lungefish that make it a little easier to deal with. Eggs can incapacitate them for a short while and are easy to get a hold of. Lungefishes also don't move from their spot in the water, so their attacks are somewhat predictable. Finally, they're much larger, meaning they're an easy target. Although, admittedly, that last fact also means they're harder to dodge than the Big Berthas. Even with all these concessions, I find it odd that an enemy as punishing as this would find its way in a game like Yoshi's Island. A game that's meant to be welcoming to newcomers. Instant death in this fashion feels a tad too cruel, but I suppose by this point in the game, the kid gloves have been taken off. Alright, I can't not mention this. The juxtaposition between the creepy castle music and the smiling hills in the background is really amusing to me. But don't get used to them, as the remainder of this level takes place underground, within the inside of pipes for a majority. It's a very fitting locale for a Piranha Plant boss, and probably takes the gold medal for most thematic stage in the game. Being inside of pipes, though, means that this level is considerably more cramped. This wouldn't be a problem, but it ends up highlighting an issue with Yoshi's kit, his egg supply. Eggs are Yoshi's strongest tool, but they're a resource. Yoshi can't produce them without first eating an enemy or finding an alternate egg resource. I'm perfectly fine with this. The issue arises when the amount of targets greatly eclipses the egg totals. It's just not as fun to control Yoshi without eggs, but most of the time, that's okay, because the moments when Yoshi is without eggs are few and far between. Naval Piranha's castle just happens to be one of those moments though, as it features loads of enemies that serve as an egg tax. These ghost enemies cannot be passed without hitting them with an egg a few times, and that's just an exercise in tedious boredom. There's several of these enemies in the level. Couple those with the propeller piranhas, an enemy that can only be shortly incapacitated by eggs, and it makes me wonder if the Yoshi's Island team knew how much of an egg drain this stage was. Let's circle back to those propeller piranhas though, because they originally had a much funnier name that I want to highlight. In the Nintendo Power Guidebook for Yoshi's Island, these Piranha Plant-esque enemies were referred to as Hootie and the Bluefish. Okay. For those unaware, Hootie and the Blowfish were a pop rock band from the early 90s known for their radio-friendly feel-good hits. You probably know a song from them and don't even realize it. They were pretty big at the time. So, with that knowledge, you're likely rolling your eyes at the fact that someone at Nintendo of America decided to shoehorn in a pop culture reference in a Mario game, and well, yes, it's a terrible name. It's not an unprecedented decision, especially for the Mario series. Almost all of the Koopalings, sans Larry, were named after famous musicians. Lemmy Kilmister, Roy Orbison, Ludwig Ahgren, Iggy Pop, you get it. Hootie and the Bluefish, pardon the pun, isn't a name that feels too out of the blue when put into that context, but still, it feels much more forced than any of the Koopalings' names, especially almost 30 years later, since Hootie is considered something of a joke in music circles. Personally, I think they're actually kind of good, but you didn't ask for my opinion. Really though, I think what kills the name for me is how much of a mouthful it is. One of the only reprieves from the cramped tubes of Naval Piranha's castle is this more conventional underground section. This might just be the most pivotal section of the stage though, as it teaches the player how to skip eggs across the water. Mastering this technique is necessary to defeat Naval Piranha, so having a section earlier in the stage to let the player practice is one of the building blocks of game design. Naval Piranha is probably one of my favorite bosses in the game. I've always had an affection for giant plant bosses, and Naval Piranha's presentation is executed brilliantly. As it drops into the water, the vines expand across the entire arena as it rises back to the surface oversized. There also appears to be either an audio channel getting obscured or a remix of the boss theme that plays during this introduction. Most likely the former, but regardless, it ends up being a happy accident. Compared to the previous bosses, Naval Piranha takes the least amount of hits to defeat, being taken out in only 3. but those 3 hits need to be done by skating eggs across the water, meaning there's more going on here. The player has to work harder for their hits than any other battle thus far. Naval Piranha still isn't all that difficult, but it still manages to be a pretty fun and involved fight. That is, provided the player didn't skip the fight altogether. Hilariously, if Yoshi snipes Naval Piranha with an egg while it's still in its bud, and the cutscene hasn't been triggered, it'll be defeated before the battle even starts. Kamek even acknowledges this, meaning this was completely intentional. This moment is great. It really rewards players that think out of the box, instead of scolding them and making them do the fight correctly. Perhaps some might point to this as an example for why bringing eggs into the boss room is an overall positive to the battles, but I don't see why both this Easter egg and eggs not carrying over into the fights can't exist concurrently. I would simply choose to remove the player's eggs once the cutscene has occurred. World 4 trades the jungle aesthetic for a swath of reds and other warm colors. If World 3 was meant to convey the hot, humid aesthetic of summer, then World 4 is firmly planted in the aesthetic of fall. It's amazing what something as simple as merely adjusting a color palette can do. The environments aren't much different from the likes of World 2 or 1, but the differing colors clearly set the areas apart. To veteran Mario players, it might come as a shock to see Goombas appear in this stage. Goombas, for some, are the Mario enemy, and second only to the Koopa Troopa. I've talked plenty about how Yoshi's Island appears to hold off on introducing too many of the more iconic Mario enemies at first, opting to drip feed them further on in the game. The Koopas took an entire world to appear, but this is on a whole other level. The game is half over and only now we're introducing Goombas. An enemy, mind you, that was already a very simple obstacle in the original Super Mario Bros., now rendered even more ineffectual thanks to Yoshi's kit. While I can't guess for certain why it's taken so long for Goombas to appear, I will say that their appearance in Yoshi's Island contrasts from their portrayal in Super Mario World. Goombas got a redesign in that game, to the point that those enemies were eventually retconned into being their own enemy, Galoomba. In Yoshi's Island, they're back to their original appearance and properties. Super Mario World has been referenced several times throughout this commentary, and I promised it wasn't without reason. In contemporary discussions of Yoshi's Island, it's widely considered to be the first entry in its own series, and not a Mario game. Because of this, many point to the prefix of Super Mario World 2 as nothing more than a cynical attempt to grab the attention of fans of the original Super Mario World. As the two games are so different, Yoshi's Island functioning as a sequel doesn't make any sense otherwise. I'd like to push back against this. While Yoshi's Island spawned its own spin-off series, at the time, it was simply one game. Its title of Super Mario World 2 may seem a little odd, but in Japanese, the title wasn't much different. Over there, it's referred to as Super Mario Yoshi Island. Yoshi is just another way to say Yoshi over there. Also, pre-release builds of the game referred to it as Super Mario Bros. 5, with Super Mario World being the fourth entry. Yoshi's Island definitely plays differently from Super Mario World, but it's not such a departure that fans of the game would have been turned off in droves by this new direction. Besides, Mario fans in the West had already experienced a Mario game different from its predecessor, Super Mario Bros. 2. These days, I think Yoshi's Island firmly stands in the spin-off category, but I also don't find the Super Mario World 2 and its name to be cynical. There's a lot of connections between the two games, all the way down to the people who worked on them. In a surprising development, there's a section later on in the stage that marks the return of the Fuzzies, who last appeared in Stage 1-7. I think it was smart to use something like the Fuzzies sparingly, since seeing them after so long comes as a nice surprise. Comparing and contrasting these two Fuzzy appearances helps to illustrate Yoshi's Island's steady difficulty curve. The first time the Fuzzies appear, they're mostly used for spectacle, but it's likely that luster would have worn off if used twice, so this section reveals that the Fuzzies are actually a pretty deadly threat in the correct circumstances. Their visual distortion and controller impairment makes what would be a fairly straightforward challenge more precarious. Finally, there's one more thing I would like to bring up, and it's all the way at this ending section of the stage. Right before the finish line, Super Baby Mario will come into contact with a flying flock of Wigglers, a returning enemy from Super Mario World. Their iconic mood swings make the Wigglers one of my favorite enemies in the Mario series. So why did I, in spite of that, completely forget that these enemies were even in the game until returning to the stage for my commentary? I soon realized the reason. This is the only place these enemies appear. An enemy like the Wiggler, a newly established veteran to the Mario games, complex in its behavior, is only used for 15 short seconds at most as a denouement to the first stage of the fourth world. This is far from the only enemy in Yoshi's Island that's like this. Hell, in this very stage there's the Goomba, but this one stood out to me. First, I'd like to answer why I think they even put this enemy at this section to begin with. If I may speculate, I believe these flying wigglers are meant to parallel the flight patterns of butterflies in the real world. When I was a kid, we'd study caterpillars at the beginning of the school year, setting them free as butterflies a few short weeks later, at the beginning of fall. That was just a nice anecdote that I wanted to share with you. Hope you don't mind that one. Next, I'd like to draw attention to why I think Yoshi's Island uses so many enemies only a couple of times or less. To be frank, Yoshi's Island has more enemies than it knows what to do with, and I think the reason for that comes back to Yoshi's Island having much of its team being plucked to work on Super Mario 64. Nogami mentioned in that interview that he spent much of that time working on backgrounds, art assets, and most importantly, enemies. Nogami stated that,
"Each day I would illustrate a character in the morning, put in an order to the programmer at noon, check it at night, and then give the okay."
Character in this context I don't specifically think means enemy, but it's likely that lots of enemies were made by Nogami this way, like the Goonie as he specifically recalls in the interview. The Yoshi's Island team seemed to be apprehensive to use the tools in its seemingly bottomless bag of tricks too many times, and perhaps this philosophy extended to the Rogues Gallery as well. While I myself am apprehensive to call this a flaw, I certainly wouldn't have minded the Wigglers appearing a few more times. There's a small section here in Stage 4-2 that caught my attention. There's this, for lack of a better word, liminal space that serves as the transition between two sections of the stage. One observation I noticed is that it's actually a two-way path, which isn't as common as one might expect for a game that expects the player to explore, but I digress. The part I want to draw most of my attention towards pertains to its appearance. As you can see, this small path actually has a wall peeking at the end of its geometry. It makes the transition look kinda silly, since Yoshi appears to be phasing into a wall. This isn't an isolated incident either. There was a similar mistake made in the previous stage, but I kinda had my hands full then. I don't mean to bring this up as a slight against the Yoshi's Island team. Rather, I feel this small cosmetic error helps to illustrate that the changes in display technology have revealed blemishes in retro games. When Yoshi's Island was released, a vast majority of its players experienced it via a CRT television over a blurry composite video output. Compare that to nowadays, where 4K resolution flat screens with methods of experiencing these titles output in razor-sharp resolutions, and the comparison is night and day. The image quality available to consumers is, and I don't use this word lightly, objectively better than the methods seen in the 90s. So why then do many retro game enthusiasts swear by their CRT televisions? Putting the latency argument to the side, that small cosmetic error seen is why. These games were not meant to be seen like this. Many game developers back then used the low resolution and display methods to their advantage. A prime example of this are the transparency effects seen mostly on Sega systems. A transparency effect there was achieved by dithering and masking that dithering via the composite image quality. To tie that closer to our example on Yoshi's Island though, CRT televisions also had a tendency to slightly crop the borders of an image. This is referred to as overscan. So the Yoshi's Island team, who likely worked on this game via CRT monitors, probably figured that no one would notice the flub, or maybe didn't even notice it to begin with. If I may offer my personal opinion on the matter, as someone who played just as many 90s games on an emulator as he did with original hardware and a CRT, I find it important to keep the context of which these games were released in mind, but I also find the razor-sharp pixel look appealing. Small exceptions aside, I find Yoshi's Island and many of its contemporaries clean up extremely well on modern televisions, assuming you remember to turn off any of those annoying post-processing effects. Oh, and filters need not apply. On the surface, Stage 4-3 seems like any other level in Yoshi's Island. In fact, it might even be a cut above. By featuring two novel platforming challenges right off the bat, with Yoshi needing to carefully navigate the countdown platforms and hitch a ride on these innocent-looking smiley balloons. There's even a small section that I feel uses the helicopter transformation well. It's an isolated area that requires a semblance of proficiency with the helicopter's controls to complete a suite of objectives. Collect the red coins, fly through the middle ring, and avoid the Patooey Piranha. It's by no means mind-blowing, we're talking about a simple square room after all, but I think it illustrates what environments suit the helicopter best. The stage caps off with a ride on a giant balloon that deflates all the way until the finish line. The pit below the balloon leads to a different area with another goal, making this stage the only one with 2 different exits. The stage has plenty going for it, which is why I'm disappointed when I say I have a huge bone to pick with this level, and it's all because of these. Fly Guys are by no means rare in Yoshi's Island. Several of these specific Fly Guys, the ones that fly on screen holding a red coin, then leave after a moment, have been encountered before, but were not mentioned. Now is the perfect time to do so, because they ruin this level on 100% completion. In a vacuum, I don't care for this enemy design. Having a time limit to collect the red coin in its possession feels like it goes against Yoshi's Island's more laid-back nature. But it wasn't until this level where I really got frustrated with them. My problem lies in whatever flag that tells the game when to spawn the Fly Guys in. There are several of these Fly Guys that can appear at the periphery of the screen and disappear without the player even realizing they missed out on 100% completion. Some might point out that Fly Guys make a noise when they leave the stage, but that doesn't always happen if the enemy is off screen, which seems like a common occurrence if my attempts at this stage are anything to go by. Collecting everything in Yoshi's Island is a task that I mostly enjoy. I wouldn't love this game the way I do if I didn't like that aspect, but there are some rare exceptions. It's one thing to flunk a stage by missing a secret area. It's another thing to miss it because of an enemy that you might not have even known flew right under your nose. That adds too much uncertainty to the equation. Marching Mild's Fort might just have the most unique introduction of any of the fortress or castle stages. It's the only one of those stages that doesn't start with the castle music, and then makes a huge splash with an exciting chase courtesy of this shark chomp. This chomp is, rightfully, a little more threatening than the falling chomp seen earlier, but it does throw its punches a bit. Contact produces damage, not instant death, and it'll start to slow its chase if Yoshi gets too close to it. It's not all that hard to run away from it, especially since Yoshi's Island doesn't feature a run button. This chase doesn't end up being all that tough once you really shake it out, but that's okay, because it has its novelty to fall back on. Once that Shark Chomp section is over, the fortress proper begins, and the level's quirk is made immediately apparent. Instead of the more linear affairs of, well, every other stage in the game, Mild's Fort is composed of 4 areas with keys at their ends that can be completed in any order. Mild's boss room is behind 4 locked doors in quick succession. The idea of segmenting a stage into small, order-agnostic chunks is surprisingly common in more linear level-based platformers. It's a way to present the player with a new kind of level design that doesn't require much tweaking to the main mechanics. In the case of the middle ring, it gives the player more of a quandary than usual. Do they take the checkpoint immediately, meaning restarts will always begin at the start of the fort? Or do they hold off until some of the sections are finished? With all that said, I've never really cared much for this level. While I don't dislike the non-linear approach, there's nothing inside of those sections that really stands out to me as an example of great level design. Perhaps the format itself is what carries this level for some, but I don't believe I'm one of those people. There's also a strange distribution of red coins in this level. Red coins are usually placed in small groupings, so I was taken a little off guard when I noticed I had 19 red coins after completing every section of the fort. I had nothing to worry about though, since the final coin was placed in one of the single screen rooms before the boss. I feel I was somewhat justified in believing I did miss something though. The boss of this level, Marching Mild, shares some similarities to her fortress. The beginning of the fight will always be the same, but once she's been stomped on once, the fight can be done in something that resembles a non-linear order. The player could stomp the Milds one by one, systematically eliminating them with as few of them on screen as possible, but the player could also challenge themselves by attacking the Milds so several of them roam the battlefield, or even do a mix of the two. I don't believe this to be anything more than a coincidence, to be clear, but both this and the method of defeat help to make Mild stand out despite her being sandwiched between 2 very exceptional bosses. 4-5 is a stage featuring a central mechanic that I'm not too fond of. To 100% the stage, Yoshi needs to guide this Chomp Rock through a significant chunk of the level, being careful not to send it into a spot it can't get out of. I'm hesitant to refer to this as an escort mission, since it's not like the Chomp Rock can be hurt or anything, but regardless. I don't find babysitting this rock to be very fun, and the multitude of stompable pegs doesn't help. Design of the level aside, I want to draw attention to this talk box that is found at the beginning of the level. This box completely dumbfounded me upon reading it for this commentary. I cannot think of a single circumstance where a player who has made it over halfway through the game does not know what a Chomp Rock is and how it works. This message box is completely pointless. Sure, it's an optional text box that experienced players can avoid should they so choose, but someone shouldn't take for granted that all message boxes give out stale tutorials like this one. Otherwise, they might miss that message box from World 3 directly from the developers. Some of these boxes impart worthwhile wisdom, which is why this box makes me roll my eyes. Another criticism I could see being levied towards these boxes is the often repeated show, don't tell methodology. I think most people with any semblance of media literacy knows what this is. It's basically a cliche at this point. So allow me to go against the grain a little and say I have no problem with the idea of message boxes explaining mechanics to new players. As nice a platitude as show, don't tell sounds as an armchair game designer, there's a certain implicit agreement between the game designer and player that most seasoned gamers take for granted. Someone who has never picked up a controller before might not even understand that something like the Super Nintendo's start button is primarily a button used to pause the game. Kind of an extreme example, but let's be honest, we all started somewhere. To bring it back to Yoshi's Island, there's even a visual language to access the message boxes that might not make sense to someone if this is their first video game. Jumping into the box is an action lifted directly from Super Mario Bros. Yoshi's Island just assumes the player will understand that. I'm not trying to pass this off as a sort of indictment. In fact, I think it's a pretty fair assumption that a game called Super Mario World 2 would be primarily played by those familiar with how a Mario game works. It also helps that Super Mario Bros. Is, to many, the de facto video game. Sometimes mechanics might be far too complex to be explained solely through gameplay, and because of that, I'm not comfortable condemning all tutorials with text. Is Yoshi's Island a super complex game? When compared broadly to the landscape of video games circa 1995, I would say no. However, I would say it's at least one of the most complex Mario games released at that time. Just because its mechanics make it more complex than prior Super Mario games, though, doesn't necessarily mean it's harder. In fact, Yoshi's Island, and the entire Yoshi series for that matter, has been saddled with a reputation that they're incredibly easy games, at least if the player isn't attempting a 100% completion. Even its designers have commented on mechanics like the flutter kick being added to assist players that aren't proficient with platforming. I still think that the flutter kick both lowers the skill floor and raises the skill ceiling, but even still, it does make the game easier overall. Coupled with its cutesy crayon aesthetic and having one of the starring characters be a newborn, Yoshi's Island is often called a baby game. Personally, I think the title is mostly used in good fun, and these days I don't really take the belittling remark all that seriously. That said, let's take it seriously for a moment. I believe that the baby game moniker isn't necessarily applicable to the original Yoshi's Island. Instead, it's something that was thrust upon it retroactively due to the aesthetic of its sequels. Yoshi's Story especially. The N64 follow-up feels much more childlike, with its cutesy sing-alongs and overall lower difficulty. The direction the sequels went almost makes the series' reputation feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I understand that I'm viewing this change through hindsight though. I also don't really feel comfortable talking much more about Yoshi's Island sequels. As farcical as it may sound when looking at this video's runtime, discussion of the sequels isn't the focus of this commentary. Maybe some other time. Right before the cave section of the stage, there's a belabored puzzle of sorts that rewards the player with a key. Said key can be taken to a bonus room hut nearby. Bonus rooms have appeared frequently in stages for the entire game, and maybe you think I'm tempted to decry these areas like I did sections like that one in World 3. But two key differences stop me from lumping these in with the secret life areas. First off, bonus rooms are much less of an unknown. They're carefully signposted by their unique doors. There shouldn't be any notion that by entering one of these thatch-covered doors, the player will be finding collectibles needed to 100% the stage. So if the player isn't interested in playing the bonus stage, they don't have to. But the bigger reason at play is the reward. Bonus stages don't reward the player with lives, but instead a whole host of items. Winning in one of the many different bonus games gives them an item that gets put on a reserve and can be activated in a stage by selecting it in the pause menu. This mechanic feels like a different spin on the reserve items seen in Super Mario World, where if Mario obtained a spare power-up while at max power, it would be kept away until the player pressed select or got damaged. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out the similarities to the item reserves of Super Mario Bros. 3. In that game, the player couldn't access an item mid-stage, but Mario's reserves are significantly larger. Yoshi's Island's item reserve mechanic feels like a mixture between the two takes on the concept. Unlike Mario 3 and World, though, the power-up quality is a little more spotty. Rewards range from the incredibly underwhelming watermelons and PAL block to the more respectable magnifying glass, an item that takes the guesswork out of discerning between regular coins and red coins for a whole stage. At the very least, there are items to accommodate most skill levels. I could see top-shelf Yoshi's Island players making good use of the egg refill item, for instance. I consider myself an experienced player, but far from the cream of the crop, so because of that, I find the most worthwhile items to be the 10 and 20 point star items. Upon activation, they give Yoshi the appropriate increase in star count. These items are the driving force behind me choosing to enter bonus games. As the game goes on and methods of collecting stars in the level become fewer and farther between, the more I'm glad to have insurance like this in my back pocket and ensure a 100% completion. Maybe to some this deflates the difficulty of an already easy game, to be able to eke out a 100% completion despite making countless mistakes. It's fine to think that, but personally I have no issue with the star items because of one stipulation the game makes when using items. They're completely off limits during boss battles. I find that to be a nice compromise, because it means if a player overly relies on items like the 10-point star, they'll still have to beat the bosses flawlessly to achieve 100%. Maybe this doesn't warrant discussion, but I have to get it off my chest. What is the point of these doors? We've seen levels that take Yoshi in and out of an underground section, but never before has it seemed so pointless. Yoshi is taken outside for half of a screen, only to be taken back to the other side of the same cave section that was already in sight. My first thought was that this area was used to put the second half of the cave into the SNES's RAM, while flushing out the first half, but this cave section doesn't appear to be nearly large enough for that to make any sense. There are many areas much larger in this very stage that don't need to resort to such a tactic. I'm genuinely dumbfounded here. Thanks to the Super FX2 and its co-processing power, Yoshi's Island is able to not just scale and rotate sprites, but run well while doing it. However, as I said all the way back in Bert the Bashful's Fort, it doesn't always maintain 60 frames per second. One surefire way to take the frame rate in Yoshi's Island seems to be tied to the logic behind egg throwing. The Huff and Puffin chicks and their unique directions while thrown will give the game a surprisingly hard time if they come into contact with an enemy. The reason I point towards the egg throwing being the culprit for the performance drop is because something similar happens when an egg is thrown into one of those arrow objects that changes the direction of the thrown egg. However, since the game state gets frozen while the egg is moving, it's less noticeable. After everything is said and done though, these events are fringe, and it would be disingenuous at best to suggest Yoshi's Island is a game with performance issues. Not to imply that's a prevailing opinion though. There's a curious helicopter bubble placed right outside of where Yoshi falls after completing one of those superfluous coin-collecting bonus areas. It's too high for regular jumps to reach it, so it can only be activated via the bonus room. I imagine it catches many players off guard, or maybe I'd just like to believe that since that's how I felt. A setup like this feels like the prime opportunity to hide some collectibles behind. It'd be a cheap shot, but not completely unprecedented. Thankfully though, all this helicopter does is give the player access to a few extra point stars. Although that, in turn, makes me question the thought process behind putting something like this here to begin with. I suppose I should be thankful they're using the transformations at all. This level features many fast-moving platforms. As a side note, I like that the speed of the platforms is color-coded. Green meaning slow, yellow having a moderate pace, and red being fast. Blisteringly fast. The red platforms move so fast that I have a hard time getting a grip of my surroundings while on one. To their credit though, Yoshi's Island retains Yoshi's velocity when he jumps off of platforms. You'd be surprised how much better this makes platforming feel. This level requires the player to have at least a remedial grasp on this concept, or else they'll miss out on some collectibles. I'm decent enough to grab the collectibles, but no better. For those much higher on the ladder, so to speak, this stage must feel quite exhilarating to play. Yoshi's Island doesn't have many opportunities to move fast like this. I may not have had many nice things to say about Marching Mild's Fort, but the finale of World 4 definitely picks up that stage's slack. Well, maybe its most obvious calling card is its use of Koopa Troopas as a major enemy, which wasn't too common a sight in previous castle stages. More commendable, though, are the instances where a Koopa shell is required to solve puzzles to progress. This gesture goes a long way in giving the castle an identity. Another refreshing aspect to the stage are the alternating color palettes. One side of the stage is red, while the other is blue. I'm unsure as to why this was done. Maybe it was a way to easily differentiate what area of the castle Yoshi was in, as this level has a little more backtracking than the usual linear affair. Regardless, I think it was a good choice. Overall, I really like this level. I only have one criticism for it, and it has to do with the flowers. In the penultimate room of the stage, 2 of the 5 flowers are practically given away to the player for free, only being obstructed by some easily breakable blocks that appear to draw inspiration from paddle-likes such as Breakout. I'm just not used to such major collectibles being clustered together like this. The level design usually does a better job of spacing them out. I don't think atmospheric or moody are adjectives you'll see many people use to describe Yoshi's Island, but in the case of this boss prelude, they're wholly appropriate. In a game where only a few bosses even get a prelude area to begin with, it's almost strange to see one that completely knocks it out of the park like what's done here. The foreboding music, the way the fog slowly creeps in as Yoshi runs across the foreground until it completely engulfs the arena and the battle begins. This is definitely the best build-up to a boss that's been seen yet, and the boss itself doesn't disappoint. A Koopa Troopa might initially seem like a somewhat boring choice for a boss, but Hookbill, in my opinion, ends up being one of the strongest fights in the game. His design toes a line between goofy and creepy. Perhaps it's due to the setup, but his eyes have that pinhole look that makes him look somewhat deranged, and I remember it creeping me out as a kid. The way he can break into a run seemingly out of nowhere contributes to this feeling as well. Hookbill as a fight is also the toughest one yet. Due in part to his erratic movement, but the fight also requires more precise and consistent aim than in prior fights, as he'll only go down after being hit with eggs a couple of times. Then he must be ground pounded to actually get damage on the board. As odd as this may seem to say, this is the first fight that requires multiple steps to damage the boss. I don't mean that as a condemnation of the prior fights, by the way. It's more so an observation that for over half of the game, Yoshi's Island was able to use both spectacle and only a small part of its main character's robust kit to craft memorable boss fights. Hookbill sets a high bar for all future fights, and not to give away the ghost, but the best is yet to come even still. The theme on display in World 5 is the tried and true snow world, seen in many a platformer game. I've made a few comments throughout this commentary expressing my appreciation towards Yoshi's Island for refraining from being too rote in its world design, and instead weaving the aesthetics together in a way that makes the 6 distinct worlds feel like different parts of the same island. Some, however, may raise an eye and call foul at that assertion due to the inclusion of a snow world. I disagree though, because I think Yoshi's Island includes a perceived against-type world like this with enough tact to make it not feel completely out of left field. First impressions are everything, and Yoshi's Island was smart to not immediately dump the player into an avalanche of snow. Instead, the first stage is cascaded with what appears to be the first blizzard of the season, from the fall colors of World 4 to the first snowfall of winter in World 5. By the end of the level, the player will be walking across a blanket of snow off the ground. And if you ask me, I think they should have waited a little longer still before completing the transition into a winter world. but the fact that there's any transition at all is worth something. All that said, does a winter-themed world even belong in a game like Yoshi's Island? A game that takes place on a tropical island? Snow isn't exactly the first thing anyone thinks of when the picture of a tropical island appears in their head. Let's get this out of the way first. Yes, snow exists on tropical islands. The summit of the Mauna Loa on the Hawaii island is frequently covered in a blanket of snow, despite its otherwise tropical locale. It's all about elevation after all. And as we'll see by the end of the world, these levels are meant to take place on the mountaintops of the island. I think there's more than enough context in the game to shut down any naysayers that claim this isn't realistic. I know I've said before that rigid world themes bother me, but there's a fine line between a snow-themed world and a world with snow. Yoshi's Island falls into the latter category in my opinion. It handles the new world theme well, and because of that there's a whole new aesthetic the designers can play with. Out of the 6 worlds, I'd say that the ones with the strongest themes are worlds 3, 5, and 6. Whereas the remaining worlds, while all having distinct looks and feels of their own, feel closer to each other than the former 3 worlds do, but I think that's enough ranting about the world's aesthetics. A more wintry themed world makes way for some unique level gimmicks. There's many ideas that would only make sense in a snow world seen here. For example, take this snowball. I imagine it wasn't too difficult to implement this object into the game, since most of the logic was reused from the already established Chomp Rock. Its implementation is a tad shallow in this stage, but the idea is solid. Unfortunately, while the variety is there, I find many of the other gimmicks and hazards introduced in World 5 to be quite boring. These ski lifts are a creative platform considering the locale, but in execution they end up causing Yoshi to just plant his feet on them and wait around while it takes him to the stage. Of course, more experienced players could simply flutter kick across this section to lessen the tedium, but I don't think that makes for a much more compelling stage. The section at the end of the level is a little more complex, but it still doesn't sell me on the idea. As someone who has played games most of his life, I've recognized that many people don't like winter-themed levels, if only because of one specific reason: ice physics. For a mechanic that seems to be universally reviled, it's fascinating how often it's implemented in the platformer games. Perhaps it's an easy way to introduce an extra challenge to a stage diegetically. Yoshi's Island has ice physics, but because of the suite of moves at Yoshi's disposal, the challenge that this mechanic is known for introducing is significantly diminished. Hopefully that would allow anyone who typically dislikes this mechanic to progress through the world with little issue. That is, assuming the incessant squeaking doesn't annoy them too much. People really need to cut Baby Mario some slack, good lord. Maybe it bothers me is a bit of a harsh phrase, but it at the very least surprised me to realize that this frigid water poses no penalty towards Yoshi when he dives into it. There's a bucket set up for him to ride along in and everything, but that can be completely ignored with little extra effort on the part of the player. I think outright killing Yoshi would have been too harsh, but it causing Yoshi damage after prolonged exposure would maybe go a long way in making this cold water stand out from every other pond in the game, as a middle ground between regular water and lava. Maybe it could have even passively removed star points while Yoshi swam in it. Even though there isn't much frigid water to be found in the stages, more complex mechanics have been used less in Yoshi's Island. To round off the talk on world-appropriate gimmicks, we have the debut of the skiing section. Yoshi dons his proper skiing attire and begins to descend down the mountain. I'm unsure if I'll ruffle feathers by saying this, but I absolutely hate this level gimmick. It's my least favorite in the game. The jumps done while skiing incorporate realism, and because of that, it feels as though there's loads of trial and error involved when going for a 100% run of the stage. And if the player misses out on a collectible during this section, they have to throw their attempt away completely and retry. There's a middle ring right before the section, as if they knew this was a problem, but the area still leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Its only saving grace is that halfway through it, all of the collectibles have been grabbed, which means the player only has to focus on making it to the end. That's still a bit challenging, especially knowing that failure means having to redo the entire section, but at least to me that feels like more of a reasonable challenge. This is a great example of the collectability mechanic in Yoshi's Island experiencing friction with the gameplay. In a regular Mario game, I might have considered this a fun distraction, but in Yoshi's Island, it's incredibly frustrating. Thankfully, like most gimmicks in Yoshi's Island, the skiing only happens a couple of times. In fact, there's only 2 stages in the game that feature it, which is too many in my opinion, but manageable nonetheless. Assuming the other stage with skiing isn't too difficult to complete. We'll get back to that. Sluggy the Unshaven's fort is a strange one for me. For whatever reason, I had a really hard time fully completing it for this playthrough. I think I had more retries in this stage than any other mainline level in the game. In spite of that, I don't think it's the hardest stage to fully clear. Outside of a few tricky jumps, the execution in this stage isn't too difficult. The level features a lot of large, open rooms, which require one's undivided attention. That's where I think the difficulty comes from. As a positive, it does make the level stand out from some of the more cramped castle and fort stages from earlier in the game. Aesthetically, the reds of said previous stages have been fully traded in for a cooler blue, fitting for its place on the world map. I feel that alone would be enough to give Sluggy's fort its own identity, but there's also a greater focus on oozes and slimes in this stage, with there being several spongy floors and viscous enemies. This one in particular really surprised me. Every time Yoshi steps on one of them, they splatter against the wall in a different pattern. I don't think I got a single repeat. It's a small, albeit great visual touch that I imagine took some work to get right, so I wanted to point it out. The final major section of this stage requires the player to stay on this liquid lift while it taxis Yoshi to the boss door. This bears similarities to certain stages in Super Mario World, where the challenge comes from getting Mario's affairs in order in every section before his ride departs. Yoshi's Island works better with the concept though, since its abundance of collectibles provide a better reason to stick around and make the most of the player's time. I think the execution could have been better though. Each section can be cleared out with plenty of time left to return to the liquid lift. This leads to there being a lot of waiting around, which is in line with the other gimmicks of World 5 to say the least. I would have liked for there to be a way to speed up the lift in some way. Maybe ground pounding on the platform could have caused it to leave prematurely. That would at least cut back on some of the tedium this section produces. Sluggy the Unshaven takes a cue from Hookbill in that it requires the player to really perfect their aim, except now the stakes are even higher. This is one of the only 2 boss fights in the game that's a race against time. Sluggy itself actually has no way of hurting Yoshi. What it can do instead is slowly inch towards Yoshi, potentially pushing him off the edge. Sluggy needs to be hit directly in its heart with an egg, but to do that, Yoshi has to hit Sluggy's body in the same spot consecutively, so its memory foam-like body adjusts to stop protecting it. This can be done in as little as 2 shots if the player is really precise. Inversely, if their aim is shoddy, which may very well happen under the duress the fight provides, it'll be even tougher to reach the heart. This boss fight is excellent conceptually, but I think the Yoshi's Island team might have overcorrected on Sluggy's health total. With a few extra hits under its belt, Sluggy could have really made players sweat. Sure, it's possible to be defeated by this boss without landing a single hit, but by World 5, players really should have a decent grip on how to aim their eggs. And if they do, the fight will be over in seconds. Sluggy is still a memorable boss, just a little too easy for its own good. There's also a little fun fact in the player's guide for Yoshi's Island, where it says that all Sluggy wants to do is give Yoshi a hug. It's not even mean, which is a pretty morbid thing to put in your guide. I don't think they ran that by the development team or anything. Alright, well, there you go. Normally this is where I'd move on to the next stage, but we're not actually done with Sluggy's fort. At the start, if Yoshi goes left, he'll come across a very perplexing room with the only regular chain chomp in the game. This room just screams secret, but some might not think to use an item to defeat the chomp, and by some I mean Kid Me. Defeating this chomp gives the player access to another room with a talk box that'll give them a button code. This button code allows the player to play all of the bonus room minigames whenever they want. They can even invite a second player for a few. I don't really have any wisdom to share on it, I just think it's a cool secret. After the fortress, the aesthetic of World 5 gets turned on its head a little. The ground scene here matches up with the alpine look of some stages in World 2. It's fitting for the colder climate of World 5, but the team managed to make the graphic feel even more at home thanks to the cool blues in the background. Speaking of the background, we have a really nice one here. We can see flocks of the Goonie enemy flying in formation, which I think is a really striking visual. The Goonie is one of my favorite enemy designs in Yoshi's Island. It's simplistic, funny, and charming all at the same time. Goonies also stand out because they function as a makeshift platform. When Yoshi stands atop one, it'll still fly in the air, but at an amusingly slower ascent. Thanks to that developer interview Nintendo did for the SNES Classic, we know that the designer of this enemy was Hisashi Nogami. It's rare that we get details as specific as that for game development, let alone a 25-year-old Nintendo game, so I'm happy to know that little nugget of info. Nogami also says that he worked on a boss as well, but didn't say which one. Apparently most of the sillier enemies in the game are his work, so if I had to guess which one was his, I'd guess Roger. Yoshi's Island was Nogami's first major project at Nintendo, and he would later go on to be a major creative force behind the Animal Crossing series, and more frequently, Splatoon. He even had a hand in the creation of the Miis. It's heartwarming to think that someone as important to some of Nintendo's most famous modern IPs showed such promise as far back as his first assignment. I feel this section of the stage draws a parallel to the original helicopter section all the way back in World 1. It's a mostly linear section with all sorts of collectibles scattered throughout. Drawing a comparison between the two shows the difficulty curve of Yoshi's Island quite well. The first foray with the helicopter was without any stakes, but now there's formations of Goonies that impede Yoshi's path. And there's no steady footing at the bottom of the section, meaning that losing a life is a real possibility. Contact with the Goonie might as well mean certain death, since Helicopter Yoshi falls down such a distance that the player would have to be cradling the ceiling to avoid triggering the death flag. Despite that fairly harsh punishment for getting hit in a vehicle that doesn't have the tightest controls, I feel this section, even with its hidden collectibles, is focused enough to not feel too sprawling and confusing. Maybe I'm warming up to the helicopter. Intentional or not, this next stage also has something in common with a World 1 stage. Not counting extra stages, there's a gap of 32 levels between this stage and the last auto-scroller, Stage 1-5. Although, unlike in the previous level, I find this auto-scroller to be less challenging rather than more. In a vacuum anyway. Solid ground is much more plentiful, ironically, thanks to the large, fluffy clouds that function as platforms. Something this level has over 1-5 though is an enemy presence, a pretty big one at that. One, or sometimes more than one, Lakitu shadow Yoshi often. There are also plenty of baseball boys, Shy Guys, Gusties, and Piranha Plants scattered throughout. Perhaps that's where the Yoshi's Island team figured the difficulty would come from this time. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a smidge hectic. However, once again, I must reiterate that the breadth of Yoshi's different moves make dispatching these enemies simpler than in most platformers. Still, I must admit that avoiding any damage at all poses a challenge. Next time we see the auto-scroller, there won't be much of a discussion over which level is the hardest. The auto-scroller may not have posed too much of a threat in this stage, but something else it has over 1-5 is length. What once could justify being a level on its own is now only one part of a larger stage. Clouds are the primary platform of this stage. Seems like almost every platformer game has at least one level that takes place in the clouds. Yoshi's Island doesn't disappoint though. These are some of the cloudiest looking clouds I've ever seen in a platformer. Giant cumulus clouds like these are what everyone thinks of when they picture a cloud in their head, but their readability as a platform isn't the best. Which is why I like that a little dotted line was drawn along the diameter of the clouds to denote what the solid ground is for Yoshi. It's an elegant solution that gives the cloud the right amount of readability without sacrificing the art style. I do have to wonder how readable it would be on a lower quality signal, like a 1080p BitCrush YouTube video or composite cables on a CRT. Maybe this touch wouldn't hold up in those environments. The penultimate stage of World 5 is the fourth level in a row to not feature any snow in what originally seemed to be a wintry themed world. I don't believe any other world in the game shifts gears quite like this world does, which might be why I like it. It still feels in theme with a colder climate. I suppose it's just a little more subtle about it. On one hand, I think I understand what they're going for here. The idea that's being conveyed is Yoshi is going higher and higher up the mountains of the island, even above its snow-crested summits. As if the level that was almost nothing but clouds wasn't a dead giveaway of that. That's a great idea, and in line with the consistency I've praised the world design for in this game time and time again. On the other hand, though, it makes me raise an eyebrow at levels like 5-5 when it has ground that is completely untouched by snow. I don't think the level feels completely out of place for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and I appreciate that there's a few different takes on the same idea all in one world. I just would have liked something in the game that better conveyed this shift. This stage also has snowless ground, but solid ground is much less plentiful than it is in World 5, so it mostly avoids my ire, at least in that regard. Most of the level takes place in either moving platforms or the falling rocks seen most frequently back in World 2. I find it a lot easier to reconcile floating rocks in the world design of Yoshi's Island than snowless grounds atop a mountain summit. Go figure. I'm not too big of a fan of this stage for reasons that are probably obvious by now. A level that consists primarily of moving platforms means Yoshi will need to stand still on a small area of ground and wait for challenges to come to him. I don't mind that every once in a while, but this has happened far too often in this world already for me to turn a blind eye to this aspect of level design. The challenges in the back half of the level fare a lot better in my mind. Since many of the rocks only begin their descent after Yoshi has touched them, there are collectibles that can only be grabbed if the descent is delayed as much as possible. I think this almost teeters onto trial and error, since there technically isn't any way of knowing how the rocks will fall, but I'm on the fence, if only because the first part with these falling rocks is pretty fishy. When first coming across it, it's unclear how far it goes off screen, so it's likely a player's first reaction is to flutter jump above it for as long as possible. Once collectibles are rewarded for that, I think the team gets a free pass to continue doing it for the rest of the level. Admittedly, the timing on the next falling rock section maybe feels a little too tight, but that might just be me. Sorry, don't mind me. I was just admiring this falling rock. I'm sure this won't come across as a huge shock, but Raphael the Raven's castle is my favorite stage in World 5. It's a pretty straightforward level that's lacking any of the more annoying level gimmicks of the previous stages. That isn't to say, though, that there's nothing about this stage that stands out. The environments throughout the stages of World 5 have been trying to convey that Yoshi is getting higher and higher up the mountains of the island. But Raphael's castle is the only stage in the world to translate that into the level design itself. This entire level is almost all vertical platforming. The background also really sells the scale. Yoshi has gotten so high up that the island isn't even visible anymore. Instead, it's almost entirely the starry sky, along with the prominent horizon of the ocean with some scattered clouds. This view is being set up for 8 levels, or maybe even the whole game if you really think about it. There's more though. It's not a new trick, but the stage has a nighttime aesthetic after a few stages of the sun setting. The moon is also prominently featured as a background element, likely done as foreshadowing for the upcoming boss fight. There's also the Raven enemies that are even more blatant in their foreshadowing. I don't only have praise for the visuals though. Raphael's castle may be straightforward, but I like its use of the bullet bills that need to be jumped on to gain a boost to grab collectibles. The extra air from jumping off enemies has been in the Mario series since the first game, but it's seldom ever used to complete stages. It's not required in Yoshi's Island unless the player is going for a 100% completion, which I think feels appropriate to ask the player to have mastery over these more advanced techniques if they're going to pursue that goal. Finally, there's this section that feels like a more thought-out version of the penultimate paddle-like room of Hookbill's castle. With the cannon enemies and the arrow platform introduced, it's much more challenging and as a result stimulating. It's not as colorful though. Raphael is another boss that subverts expectations in some way. He grows in size unlike Froggy, but he doesn't get that much bigger. His size isn't meant to impress though. His boss arena is, and I'm not talking about this very plain room. This is without a doubt one of the best bosses in the game. I feel like a bit of a broken record saying that at this point, but it's true. The Mode 7 effect is used to create a fantastic one-of-a-kind battle on the moon, over a decade before the Mario series would make its full foray into the final frontier. Because of the unusual nature of this fight, eggs were likely ruled out as an element in the battle, although I wonder how it'd look if someone managed to hack eggs into this fight. Just jumping on Raphael would be too easy, so that leaves us with the ground pound. I feel the idea that the stakes hitting Raphael, while only being introduced as a concept in this very fight, is intuitive enough for most players to figure out with little trouble. There's only so much that can be done after all. If I had one complaint about this fight, it would be trying to hit a stake while on the move. Its hitbox is pretty small, and it can be hard to judge when to press down for the ground pound. This is a pretty minor complaint though. Everything else this fight does is magnificent. Time and time again, Yoshi's Island keeps proving it knows how to deliver a finale, and despite my qualms with some of the earlier stages, World 5 is no different. Interestingly enough, despite being obliterated and turned into stardust, Raphael would one day go on to become the great protector of Yoshi's Island, and assist Mario in finding one of the 7 star spirits. Hopefully someday they elaborate on this gap in history. We're about to make our way to the final world of the game, and there's a bunch of signals that help demonstrate to the player that they're in the home stretch. One of which is the traditional world map showcase. This time it ends with Yoshi floating up in the air, followed by a fade to black, and Yoshi re-emerging on a completely new locale, the Koopa Kingdom. I'll probably never have another opportunity to mention this, so apologies if this comes across as a tad stupid. But as a kid, I thought that this was the same island as before, but that some spell of some kind had warped Yoshi's Island into looking different. These days, I think what's happening here is Yoshi somehow made it off of the moon and landed in the Koopa Kingdom. Come to mention it, I don't even think what we're seeing here is even meant to be an island. The expanse of black could just as well be more land obscured by darkness. When the player loads up the game while a file that reached World 6 is the last one played, they'll be treated to this landmass as the title screen. The title music also cuts the ambient opening moments and gets right into the melody. The end truly feels like it's in sight. While we're here though, I think it's high time I also draw attention to one of my favorite little touches in the entire game. I'm sure those who have played Yoshi's Island have been waiting for me to talk about this. Take a listen to the level select theme. It's a very vibrant and lively theme. It's also not the same theme as the other worlds, at least not exactly. Every time a world is completed in Yoshi's Island, more and more gets added to the core melody of the level select. Here are some of the other themes for comparison, this time without me chatting over them. Maybe you think this is a bit of a minor addition, but this is just one of the many small touches that contribute to Yoshi's Island feeling like this grand adventure. The closer the Yoshis are to reuniting the Mario Brothers, the more triumphant the theme becomes. Once I noticed it, it made me even more excited to complete a world and find out what would be added to the theme next. Because of the feelings it invokes, I'd probably consider it one of my favorite songs in the whole game. It's pretty hard to ignore, but I've done it with every other world before, so I'll talk about the visuals here as well. World 6 is the final world, and everything about its aesthetic fits the part. It's an oppressive atmosphere with all of the staples you'd expect from the last set of levels in a Mario game, like skeletal riffs on established enemies, dark colors, and lava of course. Gotta have lava. That said, I wouldn't try to generalize this world as the lava world, but by now I think you understand that. World 6 contrasts with the other 5 worlds by feeling antagonistic and inhospitable. Fauna of Yoshi's Island aside, each world prior to World 6 feels like a place a Yoshi could thrive in. It's their island after all. But now that Yoshi has finally left the island, that homely feeling is fittingly gone. Yoshi's on the back step for the first time, but that also means he's close to the end. The incoming chomps have returned after being gone for a while. Not much has been done to enhance their challenge though, and especially now it's disappointing to see what should be a challenging level obstacle be effortlessly wiped from existence simply by moving away from where they should spawn. I know I said earlier that I didn't want to give them too much flack for what was a common issue at the time, so I won't harp on it too much. It's there though, and I find that it does deflate from the experience. Which is an unfortunate feeling to have at the final world, where I feel the game should be pulling out all the stops to wow the player. This is thankfully an outlier, but it leads me to a bigger point. Yoshi's Island is running low on tricks. New and interesting level gimmicks have been becoming less and less frequent, and many have been reused at least once. I'm not trying to hold this against the game. The amount of spectacle Yoshi's Island has is something most games can only dream of. And it only feels natural that near the end these flourishes would become more infrequent. In fact, as I've mentioned earlier, I think that the restraint employed by not overusing many of these level gimmicks is admirable. I definitely think some gimmicks, like the large Yoshi eggs, should have appeared more often than they did, but I much prefer the occasional use of these gimmicks as opposed to some games that prefer to beat an interesting level idea into the ground. The Cave of the Bandits is the first cave level in quite some time. The last time the cave backdrop was used was all the way back in the first stage of World 5. Cave levels, or I suppose I should generalize and say underground levels, have existed in the Mario series since Super Mario Bros. An underground stage is the second level in the entire series. I speak only for myself when I say that I don't usually like underground levels in most Mario games. The look is usually pretty drab and samey. But, and try not to act surprised when I say this, I do by and large like Yoshi's Island's take on the underground levels. I appreciate the effort put in making each cave level fit in the world it's accompanying. The cave of this stage is flowing with lava, while the cave in World 5 was frozen solid. And the earlier cave stages were more typical fitting the temperate climates of their respective worlds. They've also employed different backgrounds in many of the cave levels to further differentiate them. Even if this one is as simple as changing some colors around, there's no mistaking this cave for the cave from 2.7. Finally, the crystalline ground that's a mainstay in all of these levels is very pretty. So maybe all of those aspects combined are what allows me to enjoy the cave levels of Yoshi's Island. At least aesthetically. This stage could easily be divided into 3 distinct sections. There's the first area, where the stage gets its namesake. Interestingly enough, the bandits get fewer in number the deeper Yoshi gets into the cave. If I may overanalyze this, I think this actually makes a bit of sense if one were to view the cave system as an actual home for these bandits. Typically, underground dwellers make their homes just barely under the surface of a large cave system, so in case of any sort of emergency, there's a... Okay. I'm going to lose my fucking mind. Why do they have to sound like this? Why? This is worse than the Baby Mario cry, I'm not joking. You know, at the very least, with the Baby Mario cry, the player can control when that happens. Sort of. You know, you have to kind of be good at the game, but whatever. These mouse squeaks will drone and overlap until you leave the section or you defeat all of them, and you can't really defeat all of them. It's not really possible. Or it's hard anyway. This is it's so obnoxious. It's obnoxious. It's obnoxious. Okay, speaking of Baby Mario, the final section of the stage is a Super Baby Mario transformation, and it's the final time the game will challenge the player with it. The entire area is atop spikes that are harmless to Baby Mario, but deadly to Yoshi, so the objective is clear. Get to the end, while extending the power-up time for as long as possible. This is the same as every other section with the Super Baby Mario power-up, but this time the stakes are much higher, since too large of a failure will result in losing a life. It's fitting for a final section, the stakes are high, but I think it could have been even higher. The platforming isn't time-consuming or tricky enough to make any real close calls with the power-up. That said, I admire that Super Baby Mario never felt as though it was tossed aside or forgotten about. The power-up had its abilities tested in harder and harder situations the further the game progressed. Even though it maybe didn't go as far as I would have wanted, it's much better executed than many other power-ups or gimmicks featured in Yoshi's Island. I wanted to wait on commenting on this until it was painfully obvious, and I think this is my best opportunity. This song feels like it's in complete juxtaposition with its environment. It's easy to tell that the Yoshi's Island team was struggling with its song library by this point in the game. Out of the 8 levels, 4 stages use the cavern music, 3 use the castle theme, and this one uses the athletic theme, which just doesn't work at all. This isn't a new problem though. In my opinion, Yoshi's Island was in dire need of some new songs as early as World 5, maybe even 4. Which feels a little odd to say because it has a comparable amount of music with its predecessors, but it's more noticeable here. Perhaps it's because of the strong world design and pretty much every other aspect of the game. This one sore spot becomes more noticeable as a result. Nonetheless, the game could have definitely used an extra track or two for these more dour final stages, if only as a means of breaking the monotony. Perhaps, like many other staff taken off of Yoshi's Island, its composer, Koji Kondo, was too busy working on Super Mario 64 to spare a new song for this game. Complete speculation, of course, but maybe not too ridiculous a thought either. This stage serves as another curtain call for a stage gimmick. Difference being that it's much more understated because it's sharing the spotlight with a new platform hazard. The spinning logs are this stage's namesake. They're simple to understand. One moment they're regular platforms, the next they're spinning at incredible speeds. So fast in fact that they'll send Yoshi zooming in a corresponding direction. It appears possible to maybe manipulate what direction the log sends him, but if it's possible, I wasn't able to figure out how. These platforms are pretty dangerous, but on their own, they're not all that interesting, so imagine my surprise when I realized that the fuzzies appear about halfway through the stage. Navigating these spinning logs while attempting to avoid the fuzzies feels like the logical conclusion of not just the stage, but the fuzzies as a challenge period. Last time they appeared, they were employed in a section that required slightly harder platforming than their first appearance. This could have served as a greater step from that, and would feel appropriate as a challenge in the final world of the game. To be honest, it's probably not even something I would have thought about if both these logs and the fuzzies weren't used in the exact same stage as each other. So imagine my disappointment when I realized that the fuzzies disappeared from the level as suddenly as they arrived, like dandelion spores in the wind. It's a real shame because I think this level could have been a fun and challenging one if these two gimmicks crossed paths. As it stands right now, it's a straightforward level that is more well known in my head as the stage that could have been, be it mechanics or music. The final fortress stage belongs to Tap Tap the Red Nose, and it feels like a culmination of several of the old castles and fortresses. The interior pipe areas, enemies like the Boos return, and then there's one in particular that stands out. You know things are starting to get serious when a previous boss gets demoted to regular enemy, which is something that happens with Salvo the Slime here. If this stage has any identity of its own, then it's its liberal use of the faux 3D aesthetic that's appeared infrequently up until now. I think I've made my thoughts on the look clear by now, but it's not just visual preference that leads me to somewhat disliking these sections. The depth seen here is just an illusion. These levels feel and play just like any other level in Yoshi's Island, which causes some problems with judging hitboxes. The fire sticks in particular stand out to me as the biggest offenders. The level design also feels constricted because of the faux 3D. Nothing all that exciting happens in these areas, the fact that they look so different is meant to be the exciting part. When the look is done for a couple of one-off sections, that's fine, but a majority of Tap Tap's fortress is in this style, and I believe it suffers as a result. I find the maze to be pretty easy to get lost in as it all looks the same, and the penultimate room is, at best, padding. Many things in Yoshi's Island get misconstrued for being the work of the Super FX chip. Case in point, these faux 3D sections. I'd like to take this moment to get my final words in on the Super FX chip, because there's more to its inclusion that can be discussed with regards to promotional material and how it was marketed. Nintendo was clearly very proud of the technology at its debut as the driving force behind Star Fox back in 1993. But technology can be cutthroat, and in the 90s, strides towards higher fidelities were being made faster and faster than ever. By the time Yoshi's Island had released in 1995, both the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn had been on the market for a year, each featuring graphics that would blow away consumers when compared to the average SNES game. And of course, Nintendo's very own next-generation system was looming on the horizon as well. Star Fox was an impressive showcase for the time, but I think Nintendo was worried that the general public had grown to see the Super FX chip as not nearly as impressive of a showcase when compared to its superior competitors. Unfairly so, I might add. This idea is supported by Nintendo shying away from the Super FX branding on the box of Yoshi's Island. Some might see the SNES port of Doom as the outlier here, but it wasn't published by Nintendo, so I didn't consider it in my hypothesis. Yoshi's Island wasn't the only late SNES game to not use this branding either. Winter Gold, a European-only title published by Nintendo that also used the Super FX2, released over a year after Yoshi's Island and neglected to advertise the chip. They opted instead to credit their proprietary advanced computer modeling technology. Yoshi's Island similarly came up with its own snappy term for the mind-boggling effects in the game. If you'll recall, Morphmation was the catch-all word coined to explain Yoshi's Island's more impressive effects and graphics. Why this was done could be explained by the zeitgeist of the time not being impressed with the Super FX chip anymore, ignoring the fact that this chip was a superior version of the original chip, but I digress. Maybe this made some sense at the time, but it had a ripple effect, as to this day, people are still mistaken on what exactly the Super FX2 chip does in Yoshi's Island. Perhaps this was an inevitability though, Morphmation or not. Previously, I likened Yoshi's Island's use of the Super FX2 as titanium bracers on a bridge. It smooths out a lot of the computing and gets the game running at a high frame rate, which I imagine isn't as impressive of a feat to the layman as the polygon scene in Star Fox. Morphmation as a term is a fascinating relic because it's technically a nothing term, and yet it works better to explain the effects of Yoshi's Island than mistakenly crediting the Super FX2 for them. It's fallen out of favor, but maybe it should return to contemporary discussions of Yoshi's Island. Perhaps then there wouldn't be as much misinformation out there. Our final Fortress boss isn't as much of a showstopper as Raphael, nor as interesting as Sluggy, but it still manages to have its own claim to fame. Much like the tap-tap enemies this boss is based on, hitting it with eggs alone won't defeat it. Instead, the floor it walks along needs to be destroyed, so tap-tap the red nose will fall into the lava. It's an interesting idea for a fight, and I can't help but draw comparisons to the final boss of Super Mario Bros. 3, where Mario needed to trick Bowser into creating a hole in the ground with his own attacks. However, unlike that fight, which can be pretty intense and last quite some time, tap-tap is very easy to subdue. It paints a bit of a worrying picture. We're halfway through the final world, and much of the supposed challenge has been snuffed out. It would be fair to assume that the remainder of the stages were similar in difficulty. However, the very long cave has a bit of a reputation. It's the final full auto-scroller of the mainline levels, and in my opinion, it's the hardest mandatory stage in the entire game. This level has some of the most demanding platforming challenges, and its claustrophobic caverns and frequent incoming hazards make the auto-scroll leagues deadlier than anything thrown at Yoshi in 1.5 or 5.6. Much of the surface in this beginning loop is covered in small pools of lava. Despite their size, these will instantly cost Yoshi a life. Originally, I was confused as to why this level went back to the colder cave aesthetic seen in that one stage in World 5, but I think it was used to make these lava pools stick out more. If that's the reason, it's one of the few nice gestures given to the player in this level. This is the case for practically every stage in Yoshi's Island, but the difficulty for the very long cave increases significantly when shooting for that 100% score. This door has many collectibles behind it, so reaching it is required. The problem is the chomp rock that serves as the platform to the door is incredibly precarious, and failing at this point means starting all the way back at the beginning of the stage. The very long cave showcases the unique challenges an auto-scroller can provide, while also highlighting their worst aspects. Redoing stages is just a fact of life when attempting to 100% Yoshi's Island. When redoing stages, though, friction occurs with the auto-scroller, because the player's pace isn't dictated by the player, it's dictated by the stage. In the player's head, it's already bad enough that they have to replay a stage they've already experienced, so an auto-scroller just exasperates that frustration. This beginning area of the level, which was once a challenging and maybe even exciting section, basically turns into a waiting area to that one specific section with the chomp rock and the door. The niche of exploration platformer adds even more challenge and frustration to the auto-scroller than the typical athletic platformer. In the latter, all that matters is getting to the end, but in the former, the player needs to reach the end and collect as much as they can while doing it. Perhaps this is the reason why there's only a total of 5 auto-scrollers in the 54 levels of Yoshi's Island. On the bright side, the level is kind enough to place middle rings after each of its more difficult sections. If this wasn't the case, I'd probably be much more harsh towards this final section where the auto-scroller speeds up significantly. By now, most of the collectibles have been gotten, so for a good stretch, the player only needs to focus on dodging the incoming enemies and objects at a much faster speed than usual. This is the only time the scrolling ever speeds up in any level. Maybe this could have been used to good effect in another stage, but I digress. The final challenge of the stage requires that Yoshi stomp these stakes while making sure that he isn't crushed by the newly speedy auto-scroll. I should probably hate this. It almost feels evil, considering how difficult it is to stomp one of these stakes while on the move, but I have to give the designer some credit. This is the perfect challenge to put in an auto-scroller level. And like I said earlier, the checkpoint placed shortly before this part helps to soften the blow. Every other stage usually begins as soon as the stage start jingle concludes, but for whatever reason, the deep underground maze has a noticeable pause before the player is allowed to begin exploring. Looking at the starting map ripped from the game via a level editor, you can see that there's a lot of area that isn't ever seen by the player, but is taken up by ground regardless. There are some stages that have areas as big as this one, but most of them are in open air with small platforms occupying the space. It seems to me that this area takes much longer to load into the RAM than the average Yoshi's Island stage. The smaller final section of the level is placed at the end of this map too, which also takes a while to load into, so I think my theory has some legs to stand on here. To nip any thoughts in the bud before the stage progresses too far, this stage isn't nearly as difficult as its predecessor, but what it lacks in difficulty, it makes up for in length. This level can be quite time-consuming. To give props to its name, I did end up getting a bit lost in this stage, despite it not exactly resembling what typically comes to mind when I think of a maze. I have some thoughts about its layout though. For one, I like that this final major section has the player exploring two sides of the same geometry. I don't think this concept has ever been so blatant as it is in this section. Second off, I'd like to draw attention to these numbers punched out of the wall. I think they're meant to give the player a frame of reference for where they are in the map, but if that's the answer, I'm not exactly satisfied. The numbers 2 through 6 are etched into the walls, but they're placed in a seemingly random order. If I drew a line to connect the numbers in sequential order, I'd start here at the bottom with 2, then the line moves diagonally to the right to 3, 3 moves directly up to 4, 4 cuts horizontally to the left to 5, then finally I would go downward to the final number 6. This isn't some hint on the order Yoshi needs to take on these rooms, in case you are wondering. And no, you're not mistaken, there is no number 1. Even though there is an extra cubby, it remains numberless. The more I think about this, the more it perplexes me. So I'm gonna move on. I have much more to say about the next stage. Keep Moving, for my money, is the most memorable non-castle stage in the entire game. It immediately makes an impression on the player with its level title being in all caps, with them finding out why almost immediately. The noise of the shark chomp almost blends into the noise the countdown platforms make. I wonder if that was meant to be used as some sort of camouflage, or if it was merely a happy accident. Either way, it's very exciting. This is the only mainline non-castle stage to feature the castle music. While I chastised earlier stages in this world for its reuse of well-worn music tracks, I'll balk here because in this instance I find it to be a good choice. Everything about Keep Moving, from its hit-the-ground-running pace, its flow as a stage, and even its choice in score, all help to sell that this is the penultimate challenge of the game. As a kid, I remember Keep Moving being an incredibly hard stage. Revisiting it years later has made me realize, while it's not the toughest Yoshi's Island has to offer, it's definitely worthy of its penultimate status. Keep Moving as a stage seems to be more concerned with keeping the player on their back foot rather than posing as a more straightforward challenge. There's only a few areas early on in the level where the player can breathe and plan their next move. When running from the shark chomps, instant death spikes are constantly looming below the player, waiting to catch them off guard amidst the scramble of running away. Most of the solid ground in the first half of the stage is spikes, as a matter of fact. The threat of death is ever present, but as long as the player can keep a cool head, Keep Moving won't cause too much trouble. Keep Moving has a distinct background for each of its sections. The first background is a plain dusk sky with firs littering the bottom. The second background keeps the firs at the bottom, but trades the somewhat plain sky for a beautiful decoration of deep yellow stars with a recognizable crescent moon. This background was clearly inspired by Vincent van Gogh's iconic Starry Night painting. According to Nogami, all of these backgrounds were actually hand-drawn and then scanned into the game. I don't believe Nintendo has ever shown the original drawings, or even revealed that they still exist. I would hazard a guess and say that they certainly do, though, considering how extensive Nintendo's private archives appear to be. In any case, this is a background I would love to see the original drawing of. Finally, there's this castle background, which is featured in the home stretch of the stage. Interestingly enough, this final section is the easiest part of the level by far. It even starts with a short Super Baby Mario section. This level's use of the power-up isn't done in the same context as 6-2's, which is why I treat that level as the finale of the power-up's implementation. This section feels like it's more of a victory lap. There's hardly any challenge thrusted onto the player here, which is why I neglected to mention it earlier. I will say, though, that it does give Baby Mario a heroic entry to the keep of his brother's captor, which I feel is enough to justify its inclusion. Reaching Bowser's Castle is what Keep Moving had been building towards this entire time, and it stands tall as the final major example of Yoshi's Island's strong world design. A great cap-off to a great level. With Keep Moving completed, all that's left is 6-8, King Bowser's Castle. Is what I would say. However, I'm going to flip the script a little and cover the 6 extra levels before we dive into the final stage. The extra levels were definitely intended to be completed once the game was beaten, but I want to end the video with the end of the game, not the final extra level, so I'm shoving them in here. The extra levels are the player's reward for 100%ing every single level in a world, and in that regard, they're the best reward I can think of to receive. The more the merrier, provided that the additional levels are any good. I'll leave my thoughts on them as a whole for when we're finishing up, so until then I'm going to stick to covering them one at a time. Before diving into the extra levels though, I want to point out how odd the level selection screen actually is. I never really gave it much thought in the past, but the top half of the screen being this strange set of manila folders with the 8 extra stages sharing spots with things like a score tally and a control setting, it makes me wonder why I never thought to question it before. The only connection I can think to make is that it's meant to tie into the school setting that the results screen also invokes with the chalkboard. But I digress. Let's dive into those extra stages. Poochie Ain't Stupid is the first of the bunch, and it functions as a good primer for what players can expect from the suite of extra courses. Brutal difficulty. Barring an exception or two, these courses are some of the most difficult in the entire game, and that includes this first one. The first level throws just about everything at the player. It's an auto-scroller, has an abundance of instant death lava, and the entire time Yoshi is at the mercy of Poochie. The castle theme is playing too, as if the developers didn't think the level was hostile enough. The player is expected to understand how Poochie works when entering this level, despite it technically being possible for this to be the first time seeing him, since he first appears in 2-1. Like I said, the extra levels were meant to be completed after everything else. I'm going to talk about the name of this level for a moment, since I find it to be pretty amusing, especially in Japanese. In Japanese, the name translates to "Don't say, you stupid dog." You stupid dog being in quotes. This is really funny to me, since it's basically the level designers preemptively chiding the player for something they'll most likely end up saying over time while trying to complete this level. The joke wasn't fully translated over, but I can understand just calling the stage Poochie Ain't Stupid instead, since it gets the point across while also not being as long-winded. As for the level itself, due to the reasons stated earlier, it's incredibly difficult. It isn't very long, but since the pace is dictated by the auto-scrolling, it's always going to be a bit of a heartbreak when Yoshi inevitably loses a life. This level also has no middle ring, so it has to be beaten in one go. An interesting bug can be done at the beginning of the stage. If Yoshi jumps high enough with the help of the fangs, he can actually jump over the flag that initiates the auto-scrolling and play the level without it. He has to get pretty high though, and I wasn't able to do it. It's not too long before Poochie shows up and the level starts turning up the heat, literally. Poochie needs to be coached throughout this whole level, or else the player runs the risk of them getting too far away while the auto-scroll takes them to their doom. There's a pretty moderate amount of stress sustained throughout the level, especially when going for 100%, but there's a few moments that really make heart rates rise. Like this spike ball that's basically death if it's touched. Yoshi needs to move back and forth often so Poochie doesn't go running off. There's also a couple of leaps of faith where the player will have to jump down and hope Poochie is there waiting for them. Granted, he usually is, but he can be a little unpredictable at times. The most evil trick, though, is at the end of the level, where Poochie runs off a cliff into a pool of lava below, mere steps away from the goal. This actually managed to get me on the first attempt, which really pissed me off, since I'd aced the level up to that point. The red coins sprinkled throughout the descent really encouraged me to stay on. Maybe I should have known better, but it still feels cruel. Finishing the level, we can see that Green Yoshi passes the baby to himself, which is pretty silly looking. I think it would have gone a long way if these bonus levels were handled by a new Yoshi color, but I'm not going to get too worked up about it. Future games in the series would rectify this, though. The next extra level is Hit That Switch. Unlike Poochie Ain't Stupid, this extra level actually keeps to the general theme of World 2. In fact, most of the extra levels feel at home in the world they reside. It's only extra level 1 and 4 that feel out of place. Anyway, difficulty-wise, this level actually isn't all that hard, but it can be when going in blind. Since the level requires some light puzzle solving on a timer, it's easy to mess up early into the level and not realize it until it's too late. For instance, these stars that are given at the beginning are the only stars in the entire level. Not just that, but these are also the only eggs too. At first, I thought it was strange that they made these standalone eggs instead of, say, an egg block, but I think they did this so that the piranha plants later in the stage couldn't be killed. Of course, both of these considerations can be circumvented by the items I have in the pause menu, but they couldn't and shouldn't have taken that for granted, even if bonus games are now free to play. As the name would imply, most of this level is spent trying to get from switch to switch so the player can traverse across what would be a bottomless pit. What might not be apparent at first is that the switches actually need to be pressed at specific times since their timers are quite short. Otherwise, it's actually a pretty fast level to complete. One more thing I will say though is that the jumps over the piranha plants require more dexterity than you might think. It's still a far cry from the first extra level though. The third extra level is More Monkey Madness. This is the most straightforward out of all of the extra stages, and I mean that literally. Outside of a small secret area, it's a straight shot from the beginning to the goal. That said, this level actually gave me quite a bit of trouble. There's very little in the way of solid ground for a majority of the stage, and the abundance of ukikis are annoying to say the least. This is the third extra stage in a row where a large star count is dumped onto the player right at the beginning. I think this is meant to compensate for the lack of any middle rings in these stages, or to increase the difficulty for those 100%ing the stage. Probably even a mixture of the two. It leaves little room for error when going through a level, and while that's likely the point, I don't really care for it. Just seeing a bunch of question mark clouds bundled together makes their intent seem much more transparent than usual, like they were an afterthought. One of the most interesting aspects of this stage is the red coin count. Due to what was most definitely an oversight, this level has a total of 21 red coins to find instead of the regular 20. Thankfully, it's pretty easy to tell what the odd one out of the group is, due to its position and the fact that it was removed in the GBA re-release. The coin is hiding inside of this stake, which wouldn't be unusual if not for the rotating platforms hovering right above them. Thanks to these, this coin is incredibly hard to grab. The best advice I can give is to do a full hop and sorta lead the ground pound so it lands in between platforms. Even then, after grabbing it, some weird stuff can happen. This was very obviously an error, and it doesn't even show the extra coin on the results screen, but it got me wondering about the idea of including spare collectibles in a level. One could argue that a sense of accomplishment might be lost if 100%ing a level didn't fully entail 100%ing the level. But I think that feeling could be kept so long as the game was kinda sneaky about it, in the way it accidentally is here. If an additional red coin was added to a few levels, I'd wonder if a majority of players would even notice. If there weren't so many levels with points of no return where collectibles can be missed, I'd be less receptive to this idea. To provide a counterpoint though, I do believe that this would make the scoring aspect of the game less straightforward, and I think there's something to that simplicity. What you see is what you get. There will always be 20 red coins, 5 flowers, and a way to accumulate at least 20 stars in a stage. Spares would introduce an uncertainty to the formula, especially if they weren't in every level. So I guess I'm kinda of two minds about the whole thing. World 4's extra level is the Impossible Maze. There's a question mark after the impossible right there, but it sounds silly to read it like that out loud. This is the only other level besides Poochie Ain't Stupid to not be in theme with the rest of its world. A level composed entirely of pipes like this fits much more in World 3. It makes me wonder how the extra stages came to be during development. Their higher than average difficulty, as well as the game's scoring system, make me believe that the idea of rewarding the player with an extra level came fairly early in development, but of course I can't be sure. It just feels strange to me for a majority of the extra levels to keep to a theme only for it to be broken, but I'll stop bringing it up. You're probably all sick of me babbling about it by now. Besides, there's plenty to talk about when it comes to discussing the level itself. First off, something everyone will immediately notice when starting this stage is its use of the pre-boss fight theme. This is the only level to make this song its main melody. The only level that comes close to using it for as long is 6-8, the final level of the game, but even still, it's not during the entire level. There's a bit of novelty in hearing a song that's usually only heard for a few seconds be the driving theme of a course, but it also magnifies just how repetitive the song is. I don't mean to disparage this track, because I actually do quite like it, but it's clearly a tune that wasn't meant to be heard for as long as it's heard here. In addition, I feel like it also further proves my point I made earlier about the sound selection for Yoshi's Island being too sparse. I get the feeling that they wanted to use a foreboding song to increase the feeling of hopelessness in the player and really put the impossible in Impossible Maze. And the song of choice fits the best out of the selection available, but it isn't ideal. This level is a prime example for showing off how starved for content Yoshi's Island is in some aspects, while being spoiled with an embarrassment of material elsewhere. This is, yet again, something I brought up earlier with the Wiggler enemies, but it bears repeating just how ridiculous the amount of enemy variety Yoshi's Island has. The Impossible Maze is home to a wholly unique enemy called a Grim Leecher. They're one of the only enemies in the level, so attention is drawn to them immediately. It'd be one thing if these were just a reskin of an existing enemy, but I don't believe they are. At the very least, their programming is slightly different from the likes of, say, the Sheet Ghost enemy. Grim Leechers will slowly chase Yoshi, and when they come into contact with him, they replace Baby Mario on Yoshi's back. While this is happening, the controls are reversed, and Yoshi will take on this pinkish color. The only way they can be defeated at this point is by ground pounding. Maybe this is just me, but I'm incredibly astounded over how complicated this enemy is. It's one of the most unique in the game, and it can only be found in a level that the majority of players will never even see. The cynic in me feels as though Yoshi's Island is too frivolous in some aspects. Some games struggle to have a quarter of the enemy variety Yoshi's Island has, and yet, in this game there are a handful of creatures we only see a few times throughout its decently long adventure. I try not to be cynical, though. Really, I was just amazed I had seen a new enemy in a game I'd been playing my entire life. Besides, it's not as if cutting some of the enemies would have meant that Yoshi's Island would have gotten an extra song. That's not how it works. If you can believe it, there's yet even more to discuss about this level, and it has to do with solving this impossible maze. There's some light puzzle solving here, and it involves pushing these wooden crates so that they create a path to the opposite side via these holes. This is a pretty clever trick, and the only time the game ever expects the player to move a platform so it's flush with a door. I also like that they opted to make it a destroyable object like a crate instead of a chomp rock. The entire game the player is conditioned to stomp on crates without a second thought, but if they do that here, they're punished. It preys on expectations well without being unfair. After all, the extra levels have been difficult in one way or another, so the player should be expecting to be challenged in some way in these levels. It's just that this one focuses more on critical thinking skills rather than physical execution. The same cannot be said for the 5th extra stage, Kamek's Revenge. I'm just going to go out and say this right out of the gate. This is by far the most difficult level in the game when attempting a 100% run. But honestly, if someone was playing the bonus levels to begin with, that's more than likely the only type of run they're doing. The entire first area of this stage seems as though it is hell-bent on harassing the player ceaselessly. Kamek constantly flies into the foreground, and there's a litany of baseball kids, meaning Yoshi can never stand in one place for too long and breathe. It's actually not this first section that I have such a grudge against, though. It's the second part. Befitting the snowy locale, we have the long-awaited return of the skiing minigame. It frankly baffles me that they would bring this mechanic back at all, and makes me wonder if its inclusion is meant to be at the player's expense. At the very least, this time it appears they learned their lesson from before and put signposts up to convey when to jump to collect all the red coins. Usually. Kamek also is typically unable to collide with Yoshi since his flight patterns rarely align with the ski path. The trouble with this section comes after the screen transition, where missing one poorly telegraphed jump can kill an attempt all on its own. It really rubs me the wrong way and sours me on what should be an exciting level. One insidious problem with this level stems from Yoshi's Island's lives system, which I've neglected to mention much up until now. The reason being because lives feel like a dated concept in a game like Yoshi's Island, and are here mainly due to obligation. In a more forward-thinking move, Yoshi's Island saves the player's progress after the completion of every level, which was quite forgiving for the time and practically a standard feature in more modern games. The only drawback to a game over is losing progress in a level via a middle ring, but that's not likely to happen often, as the player is showered with lives after only half a world's worth of levels, and the levels themselves usually aren't too difficult. To counterbalance this, all of the lives are taken away when quitting the game, so the player will always start back at square one when starting a new play session. Which finally brings me back to Kamek's Revenge. Being a stage that demands such high peaks of perfection means only the most confident, or lazy, players should attempt it without grinding lives. Each 100% clear of a world grants access to a bonus game on demand in addition to an extra level, but between their inconsistency and flashiness, it's more time-consuming than one might hope. Personally, I found grinding for lives when attempting this stage to be especially grueling. I really wanted it over and done with as soon as possible, but I was forced to divert my attention away from attempts just so I could more consistently pull off more attempts. It was only long after I finished this stage that I realized that there actually was an easier way to grind for lives. Ouch. And even better yet, there's still more level afterwards. There's a lengthy helicopter section that begins with an attack that feels genuinely mean. Speaking honestly, this section isn't nearly as difficult as the skiing section, but it can be pretty nerve-wracking knowing that one screw-up can send you back to before the skiing section was even completed. The same principle seen in the first section of this level also applies here. Staying still is death. Kamek is still chasing Yoshi, and there are also baseballs pelting the poor dinosaur from all directions. One hit will send him falling for an unfortunate amount of time, and will most likely put him past the kill screen. All that said, there are some things about this section that I do appreciate. For one, if the player is careful, they can fly around as the helicopter for quite some time, thanks to there being an extra bubble in the middle of the valley. The baseball boys' projectiles also flag red coins as collected if they collide. It's surprisingly lenient for a level that's practically done nothing but be relentlessly challenging up to this point. The last red coin is even in this section, so as long as that noise is heard, the player can rest assured that they're good to go. There's one small final section remaining that I didn't find much trouble with, and with that, the hardest level in Yoshi's Island is complete. Thank God. All that's left now is the extra stage of World 6, Castle's Masterpiece Set. This level can only be accessed after the game is already complete, meaning that this is the true finale of Yoshi's Island. And aspects of that level definitely reflect that. There's a lot of spectacle in this stage, from the Yoshi dotted line to the sections that require almost no input from the player to complete. Ironically, I find this stage to be the easiest out of the suite of extra stages. However, I might be in the minority when it comes to that thought. It's for that reason, though, that I'd also consider this my favorite of the extra stages. Almost every other extra stage doesn't feel like a fully fleshed out level, and instead feels more like one idea stretched out as far as it can. The only other stage that feels as though it has sections to it is Kamek's Revenge, which I find to be too hard for its own good. Castle's Masterpiece Set, on the other hand, feels complete. It has my favorite aesthetic in the game, defined sections, and isn't frustratingly difficult. I think it's a great encore for Yoshi's Island, and helped to wash away the negative feelings I got from Kamek's Revenge and end the game on a high note. My thoughts on Kamek's Revenge aside, I think that the extra stages are, for the most part, decent. There's some interesting ideas used in levels like the Impossible Maze, but on a whole, the levels, barring castles, feel like they're, for lack of a better word, extras. As they are now, I feel as though they could have been better, but they function as satisfying rewards for 100%ing every stage in a world. That begs the question though, what happens when all of the extra stages are completed 100%? Well, there is a reward, but it's not very compelling. Fully 100%ing a world nets the player a star icon in the main menu for a total of 6. This is a pretty lackluster reward, however, the buck had to stop somewhere. It's not as if they could have rewarded the player with yet another suite of stages ad nauseum, but surely it could have been better. If I may make a suggestion for an alternate reward that likely wouldn't have been too difficult to implement, perhaps the reward could have been some way to play around with the different Yoshi colors, or maybe even an all-new unlockable Yoshi, like the black and white Yoshi seen in future titles. I believe that players are more attached to the different Yoshi colors than one might think. Everyone has a favorite color after all. It's not a huge reward, but I think it would have been enough to make superfans satisfied. That's about all I have to say on the extra stages, so strap in as we start the final level of Yoshi's Island and prepare for the finale. The final level of Yoshi's Island bucks the trend of having the dark blue Yoshi handle the castle, and instead hands the honor over to the green Yoshi. It's a choice that feels very appropriate, and I'm not just saying that because green is my favorite color. The green Yoshi is for all intents and purposes the de facto Yoshi, and has been since the character's inception. The stage begins with a straightforward helicopter section, which I'm not all that bothered by, surprisingly. This combo of the helicopter navigation while avoiding a bombarding Kamek would be reused in the previously discussed infamous Kamek's Revenge stage. And compared to that stage's execution of the same strategy, this is basically child's play. This is the first of 2 gameplay obstacles that convey just how desperate Kamek is to get Yoshi out of his master's castle. His speeches before each boss fight have gotten more and more neurotic, but this is the first time he's actually attempted to take matters into his own hands. Once Yoshi enters the castle proper, the defining feature of King Bowser's castle is revealed. Yoshi can, in a loose sense, choose between one of 4 different doors. Behind each of these doors is a unique area, making this final stage a modular one. And yes, I do believe that this is yet another reference to Super Mario World, as something very similar was done with that game's final stage. Doors 1 and 2 are straightforward castle levels. Door 3 is an auto-scroller where Yoshi is chased by a golden Tap-Tap the Red Nose. And finally, Door 4, the one I hit, is a faux 3D free pass to the next part of the stage. I wish I knew what their fascination was with this branching path idea, because I clearly don't feel the same way about it as they did. To me, this deflates the finality of the castle somewhat. Ignoring Door 4, which is obviously meant to be the easy path, each of the other doors would have functioned fine in tandem with each other. I would have vastly preferred a more linear stage that combined elements from all of the separate doors and done away with the branching paths idea entirely. I'm not saying that the final stage is a complete letdown though. This final section before the boss fight helps immensely in salvaging my opinion of the level. It's our final auto-scroller, and unlike the very long Caves auto-scroller, this one doesn't seem concerned about being difficult. Instead, it uses the auto-scroller hazard in a way not yet seen in Yoshi's Island, building tension. Throughout this section, Yoshi will be bombarded by a now broomless Kamek, teleporting all over the place, slinging spells while the foreboding Room Before Boss music drones on in the background. This is the second example showcasing Kamek's desperation, and it's the closest the player gets to an actual confrontation with the Magic Koopa. Kamek has essentially morphed into Yoshi's rival as the years have gone on, but despite that, I can't help but feel bad for him. Kamek's status as a named character has been muddy going as far back as this game. In the West, this is a specific character from the race of Magic Koopas who is named Kamek. But in the original Japanese text, Kamek is the name for all Magic Koopas. So Kamek originally was only a named character in the Western release of the game. Magikoopas that are referred to as Kamek have appeared fulfilling a similar role, but with nothing to differentiate him from the generic Magikoopa enemy, his status as a major Mario character is called into question. It's strange to me that a series like Mario, which has gotten so stringent over the years with its portrayal of characters, still has this inconsistency weaved into its lore. If I had my way, Kamek would have had some sort of redesign years ago to help differentiate him from generic Magikoopas. Maybe that's what they tried to do with Kamikoopa in the Paper Mario games, but I'm afraid that gets us dangerously close to a conversation for another time, so I'll leave it at that. Yoshi's Island had made it clear that Bowser would, at some point, appear in the game. Kamek references him as far back as the first fortress. What I think was meant to be a surprise, however, was his appearance. Perhaps to some, Bowser being a mere child in a game with an infant Mario isn't all that shocking, but I wonder if at the time, the way Kamek refers to Bowser throughout the game gave players some pause about his status. He's still called King Bowser after all. Up until now, Kamek's increasingly manic behavior could have been interpreted as him solely being worried Yoshi would rescue the other baby, but the reveal of Baby Bowser puts a subversive spin on the behavior. He's a nanny who didn't want to wake up his bratty child. Baby Bowser seems blissfully ignorant of the actions occurring around him, but still acts aggressive towards Baby Mario because he wants a turn on the Queen Donkey. I find his characterization, as little as there is, to be highly amusing. It also helps to let the player's guard down after the young king is easily defeated. Whenever I've been discussing some of my favorite bosses in Yoshi's Island, I've had to pull my punches a little. Hookbill, Raphael, Navel, all of these are great fights, and in a lesser game, maybe they would be the best one. But Yoshi's Island's final boss is an absolute showstopper. What better way is there to end your game full of oversized bosses than by making the final boss be what was the largest boss in Mario history? This isn't hyperbole when I say that Big Bad Baby Bowser is not just the best boss fight in the game, but might even be my favorite boss in any video game I've ever played. The suspenseful intro gives the player just enough time to get their bearings and their mind racing on just how exactly Bowser is going to fight back for round 2, and the reveal is legendary. When I was a kid, this fight was genuinely terrifying to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that thought. The way Bowser slowly looms towards Yoshi, only to sporadically break into a sprint, is masterfully done. I've been lamenting Koji Kondo's score being worn out a lot in the twilight of this commentary, so I want to give him plenty of props for his contribution to the final boss. If the atmosphere of the fight rightfully terrified me as a child, Kondo's music amps me up as an adult. It's a total belter and it feels wholly earned. It's some of his finest work. The gameplay of this final battle turns the central mechanic of egg throwing on its head a little, which may rub some people the wrong way, but I think it works. Judging the depth of the background may be a little difficult at first, but the player has plenty of times to get the grips with the new mechanics before Bowser has completely eclipsed the background and destroyed any of the solid ground Yoshi can stand on. The effect done to make Bowser look like he's getting closer from the background is my favorite effect in the game, and it was accomplished with good old-fashioned Mode 7. The grand finale of Yoshi's Island and the Mario team's final send-off to the console was made possible not by using the Super FX chip, or even HDMA, but by using the Super Nintendo's claim to fame, its calling card. While many more Nintendo-published titles would release on the Super Nintendo for years to come, I see Yoshi's Island as Nintendo's swan song to the console. It was the last tentpole release internally developed by the EAD team for the system, and it does just about everything it possibly can to wow players before rolling the credits, even going as far as to employ some of the most state-of-the-art add-on chips to make it all possible. Visually, Yoshi's Island has not only stood the test of time, it's frankly put titles released decades later to shame. Distinct and iconic art direction has become a trademark of the Yoshi series since, thanks to Miyamoto and the rest of the team's insistence on the hand-drawn look of this title. When it comes to gameplay, Yoshi's Island also doesn't disappoint. It's absolutely chock full of levels filled with fun and exciting challenges. Everything about this game showcases the finest work the Super Nintendo has to offer. Yoshi's Island is a stone-cold classic game, and also one of my favorite games of all time. But, of course, no game is perfect. If you've made it this far, then you probably know that by now. When I was a kid, Yoshi's Island was something of an infallible game in my eyes. I see now that it definitely has some low points and the occasional head-scratching decision. I truly never did get won over by the transformations. The music selection, while strong, is stretched unfortunately thin. Many mechanics get tossed aside before they can reach their true potential, and there's plenty of other smaller nitpicks I observed over the course of this playthrough. In spite of all the new perceived flaws I've managed to articulate for myself via the making of this video, I feel my appreciation for the things I love about Yoshi's Island to be deeper than ever before. I hope that this video has done the same for you as well. If it didn't, then I hope you at least enjoyed me talking about Yoshi's Island. It's a game that I could apparently talk about for hours. And interestingly enough, it's a game where there's also a lot of fun to be had discussing things surrounding it as well. So if you'll indulge me, stay tuned in the near future for the Yoshi's Island bonus video, where I'll discuss the Game Boy Advance port of the game, its promotional material, and most importantly, its beta content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back soon.